Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that'll make you reconsider every period drama you've ever swooned over. Summer in a Victorian city. Not the Jane Austen garden party kind. Not the elegant parasols and lemonade kind. I mean the actual, sweltering, disease-riddled, sewage-soaked nightmare that was urban life in the 1800s. We're talking about a season so horrifying that people genuinely feared it more than winter. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let's pause and ask ourselves some questions. Have you ever complained about a hot summer day because your air conditioning wasn't cold enough? Ever gotten annoyed because your ice cream melted too fast? What if I told you there was a time when summer meant dodging actual rivers of sewage in the street? When the heat didn't just make you sweaty, it made entire neighbourhoods smell like open graves. When your biggest summer concern wasn't sunburn, but whether the water you just drank would kill you by Thursday? Could you survive 3 months in a city where garbage, human waste and rotting animal carcasses just sat there, baking in the sun? Where your neighbours dropped dead from diseases you'd never even heard of, and everyone just kept going to work like it was normal? Congratulations! You've just woken up in London, summer of 1858. The year of the Great Stink. You can smell it before you even open your eyes, and trust me, it only gets worse from here. Let's start with the river, because if you're going to understand Victorian summer, you need to understand what happened to the Thames. Once upon a time, this river was beautiful, teeming with fish, bordered by green banks. By the 1850s, it had transformed into something closer to a slow-moving toilet. Every drop of sewage from millions of Londoners, and I mean every drop, flowed directly into the Thames. No treatment, no filtration, just straight from chamber pot to river. Picture this. Over 2 million people living in London, all doing what humans do, eating, drinking and producing waste. Where did that waste go? Into cesspits in their backyards, sure. But those cesspits overflowed constantly, and when they did, everything drained into street gutters that led directly to the Thames. It was like the world's worst water slide, except instead of children screaming with joy, it was Londoners screaming as they realised their drinking water came from the same place their sewage went. The river didn't just smell bad, it looked bad. During summer, when the water levels dropped and the temperature rose, the Thames took on a thick brown consistency that witnesses described as like pea soup, which is possibly the worst comparison for soup in human history. The surface was often covered with a greasy film, and chunks of, well, let's just call it matter, floated past like the world's most disgusting parade. You couldn't escape it either. The Thames ran right through the heart of London. If you lived near the river, and millions did, you were treated to a front row seat to this aquatic nightmare. Open your window on a summer morning. Instant regret. The smell would hit you like a punch to the face, a thick choking stench that combined human waste, rotting garbage, dead animals, and industrial chemicals into one unforgettable bouquet. Here's what makes it even more horrifying. People still use the Thames for everything. It was the city's main source of drinking water, its transportation highway, its industrial dumping ground, and its sewer, all at the same time. Imagine using your bathtub as a toilet, a kitchen sink, a garbage disposal, and then filling up a glass and drinking from it. That was essentially the Thames. Water companies would set up their pumping stations along the river, sucking up the brown water and sending it through pipes to homes and businesses across the city. Some companies made a token effort to filter it, and by filter, I mean they'd let it sit in a reservoir for a day or two so the chunks could settle to the bottom. Then they'd pump the slightly less chunky water to their customers and call it a day. It was like straining swamp water through a dirty sock and calling it purified. The fish, unsurprisingly, had evacuated. Salmon, which had once been so plentiful in the Thames that apprentices allegedly complained about having to eat it too often, disappeared entirely. Nothing could survive in water that was essentially liquid death. Even the hardy eels that could tolerate almost anything gave up and left. When the eels abandon ship, you know things are bad. Industrial waste added an extra special touch to the Thames cocktail. Factories pumped chemical runoff directly into the river. Slaughterhouses dumped blood and animal parts. Tanneries contributed their own special blend of toxic chemicals used in leather processing. Dye works added vivid streaks of colour, so at least the sewage was festive. The Thames wasn't just polluted, it was a chemistry experiment gone catastrophically wrong. In summer, all of this intensified. The heat acted like a massive incubator, encouraging bacteria to multiply at terrifying rates. The smell became so powerful that it wasn't just unpleasant, it was physically overwhelming. People reported nausea, headaches, and difficulty breathing just from walking near the river. Passengers on river ferries would gag and retch during their crossings. Some held handkerchiefs soaked in perfume over their noses and mouths, which helped approximately 0%. The Thames also became a dumping ground for anything people wanted to get rid of. Dead dogs, dead cats, dead horses. If an animal died, there was a decent chance it ended up in the river. Some estimates suggest that dozens of dead animals floated down the Thames every single day. In summer, they'd bob along in various states of decomposition, adding their own special aroma to the mix. Think of it as nature's terrible version of a lazy river ride. Children still played near the Thames, because children are both resilient and lacking in self-preservation instincts. They'd wade in the muddy shallows during low tide, searching for anything valuable that might have washed up. Coins, bits of metal, interesting rocks, anything that could be sold. These mudlarks, as they were called, spent hours in water that was essentially toxic sludge. The fact that any of them survived to adulthood is a testament to either divine intervention or incredibly robust immune systems. The truly mind-bending part is that this situation persisted for decades. It wasn't like Londoners didn't notice the problem. Everyone knew the Thames was disgusting. Everyone knew it was making people sick. But fixing it would require massive infrastructure changes, enormous amounts of money, and forcing people to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, dumping raw sewage into your drinking water source was a bad idea. The wealthy, of course, tried to insulate themselves from the worst of it. They moved to neighbourhoods farther from the river. They paid for water from private companies that claimed to have cleaner sources. They burned incense and perfumes in their homes to mask the smell. But even Parliament, housed in the magnificent Palace of Westminster right on the Thames riverbank, couldn't escape. The members of Parliament, those powerful gentlemen making decisions for the entire nation, spent their summer days trying not to vomit from the stench wafting through their windows. It took the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell became so unbearable that Parliament literally couldn't function, for anyone to take serious action. Even then, it took years to build the sewage system that would finally give the Thames a chance to recover. Years of additional summers with a river that was more septic tank than waterway. So the next time you turn on your tap and clean water comes out, or you flush your toilet and the waste disappears to a treatment plant somewhere far away, take a moment to appreciate that you're not living in Victorian London, where the centrepiece of the city, the grand historic Thames, spent every summer actively trying to kill everyone who came near it. Because nothing says empire at its peak quite like a river you can smell from 3 blocks away. You wake up sweating. It's already 80 degrees and the sun's barely up. There's no shower waiting for you, no cool water from the tap, because guess what? There is no tap. If you're lucky, you've got a basin of water that's been sitting in your room since yesterday. It's warm, vaguely grey, and you're supposed to use it to wash your face, hands, and whatever else you can reach before the water turns completely opaque. This is morning hygiene in Victorian summer. Not the refreshing wake-you-up experience you're used to, but more of a symbolic gesture toward cleanliness that accomplishes very little. You dip your hands into the lukewarm water and immediately feel a thin film on the surface. Dust, dead skin cells from yesterday, and whatever else has been floating around your bedroom all night. It's like washing your face in day-old soup. You splash it on your skin anyway, because this is literally the only water you've got until someone hauls up more from the pump downstairs or the well outside. Speaking of that pump or, well, the water coming from it is questionable at best. If you live in a decent neighbourhood, maybe your building has a shared pump in the courtyard that draws from a supposedly clean source. If you're poor, you're getting your water from a public pump that serves hundreds of families and is probably located suspiciously close to a cemetery or cesspit. Either way, nobody's testing this water for safety. Nobody's treating it. It's just Water. With bonus mystery ingredients. The wash basin itself is a fascinating artefact of Victorian priorities. It's usually a ceramic bowl sitting in a matching pitcher on a washstand, and it represents the absolute pinnacle of your washing capabilities. This basin is your shower, your sink, your bathtub, everything. You're supposed to make it work for your entire morning routine, and you'd better not spill any, because refilling it means another trip downstairs or outside, and you've got approximately 12 minutes before you need to start getting dressed for work. Let's talk about soap for a second. If you're working class, you might not have any. Soap was expensive, and most families saved it for laundry day, not for daily washing. If you did have soap, it was probably a harsh, lye-heavy brick that could strip paint off furniture. Rubbing it on your face felt less like cleansing, and more like aggressive exfoliation with sandpaper. Your skin would feel tight, dry, and vaguely burning. But hey, at least you'd removed some of the grime. Probably. Maybe. It was hard to tell in the dim morning light. Your teeth, by the way, are already a lost cause, but you're supposed to at least make an effort. Toothbrushes existed, but they were luxury items with bristles made from animal hair, usually boar or horse, that went soft and bacteria-filled after a few uses. Toothpaste was even more suspect. You might have tooth powder made from chalk, crushed brick, or even charcoal, which you'd rub on your teeth with your finger or a cloth. It tasted awful, barely worked, and sometimes contained mildly poisonous ingredients. But at least you tried, which is more than many Victorians could say. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the chamber pot under your bed. Yes, you used it during the night. No, you haven't emptied it yet. It's sitting there, maybe covered with a cloth if you're fancy, contributing its own special aroma to your bedroom's already questionable atmosphere. The contents have been warming up all night, and now, in the morning heat, they're starting to really announce their presence. This is what you're smelling while you wash your face in yesterday's water. Refreshing, isn't it? Emptying the chamber pot is a whole adventure in itself. If you're a woman, you're probably responsible for this delightful task. You've got to carry the pot downstairs, trying not to slosh the contents, and dump it either into the cesspit in the backyard, into the gutter in the street, or if you're particularly unlucky, into a shared privy that serves your entire building. In summer, all of these options are terrible. The cesspit is overflowing and surrounded by flies. The gutter is already flowing with everyone else's waste, creating a slow-moving river of horror. And the shared privy? Let's just say that 30 families using the same toilet in 85-degree heat creates an experience that violates several human rights conventions that won't be written for another century. If you're really poor, you might not even have a chamber pot. You've got a bucket, or a shared pot for the whole family, or you're making nighttime trips to the outdoor privy in the dark, which comes with its own set of horrors we won't get into right now. The point is, your morning routine starts with the lingering smell of human waste, and that's just considered normal. Hair care in Victorian summer was its own special nightmare. You couldn't just hop in the shower and wash your hair whenever you wanted. Washing hair was an elaborate, time-consuming process that most people only did once every few weeks, if that. You'd have to heat water, which meant lighting a fire even though it was already sweltering, apply soap that would leave your hair feeling like straw, rinse it out with multiple basins of water you'd have to haul yourself, and then wait hours for it to dry. In summer, your hair would be damp and sweaty within minutes anyway, so most people just didn't bother. Instead, you'd try to style your dirty, sweaty, probably lice-infested hair into whatever fashion demanded. Women would brush it, spreading the natural oils and any parasites evenly throughout, and pin it up in elaborate arrangements that trapped even more heat against their scalps. Men kept theirs shorter, but still slicked it back with pomade made from bear grease or other animal fats that would slowly go rancid in the heat. Imagine spending all day smelling your own hair turning into expired bacon grease. That was fashion. Deodorant obviously didn't exist. Antiperspirant? A fever dream from the distant future. You were going to sweat, and that sweat was going to smell, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it except maybe dab some perfume on your wrists and hope for the best. Spoiler alert, perfume plus body odour doesn't create a pleasant blend. It creates a confusing olfactory assault that makes people wonder if you're wearing flowers or if something died in your armpit. By the time you've finished your morning routine, you're already tired, still dirty despite your best efforts, and you haven't even gotten dressed yet. The water in your basin is now dark grey and has a thin scum floating on top. Your chamber pot needs emptying. Your bedroom smells like a combination of stale sweat, chamber pot fumes, and whatever's wafting in through your window from the street below. And the day has barely started. The Victorian morning routine wasn't about getting clean. It was about maintaining the illusion of cleanliness long enough to appear respectable to your neighbours and employers. Underneath everyone's carefully arranged hair and pressed clothing was the same unwashed, sweaty reality. Everyone knew it. Nobody talked about it. And everyone secretly wondered if they smelled worse than everyone else. Spoiler, they all smelled terrible, equally. Hungry? Too bad, because breakfast in a Victorian summer was a gamble with your digestive system. There was no refrigeration, remember? That means the milk delivered this morning, if you could afford milk, was already starting to turn in the heat. The butter? Melting into a sad, oily puddle. The bread? Fine, if you didn't mind sharing it with weevils. Let's start with that milk, because it's a perfect example of Victorian food roulette. The milkman delivered it early in the morning straight from the cow, or at least that's what you hoped. In reality, urban dairies were nightmarish operations where cows were kept in filthy cellars, fed on brewery waste, and milked by people who'd never heard of washing their hands. The milk itself was often watered down to increase profits, sometimes with water pulled straight from contaminated pumps. Bonus, that water might also contain chalk or plaster to make the diluted milk look whiter and thicker. So you've got this suspicious milk sitting in a jug on your kitchen table. It's already lukewarm. Within an hour or two, it'll start to smell off. By midday, it's officially sour. But you've paid for it. And money doesn't grow on trees, so you're faced with a choice. Drink the questionable milk, use it in your tea to mask the taste, or just accept the loss and throw it out. Most Victorians went with option 2. Nothing hides the taste of spoiled milk quite like boiling water and leaves that have been sitting in a tin for 6 months. The butter situation is almost comical. Victorian households kept their butter in covered dishes, sometimes sitting in shallow bowls of cold water to keep it slightly cooler. In summer, this was laughably ineffective. You'd cut into your butter in the morning, and it would be firmish. By breakfast end, it was a yellow puddle oozing across your plate, soaking into your bread, dripping onto the table. Trying to spread melted butter is like trying to paint with water. Technically possible, but mostly you're just making a mess. And that bread. Oh, that beautiful fresh-baked bread that you bought yesterday from the corner bakery. Except here's a fun fact. Victorian bakers routinely added things to their bread that weren't flour. Alum to make it whiter, chalk or bone ash to increase the weight, sometimes sawdust to bulk it out. Your morning bread might contain enough non-bread materials to qualify as a building material, and if you stored it wrong, which was easy to do in summer, it would develop a fascinating ecosystem of mould and insects within 24 hours. Weevils were the most common bread companions. These tiny beetles loved flour and grain, and they were everywhere in Victorian kitchens. You'd slice your bread and see little holes bored through it, tiny evidence of your unwanted breakfast guests. Most people just picked out the visible weevils and ate the bread anyway. Protein's protein, right? Besides, buying fresh bread every single day was expensive, and wasting food was unthinkable when you were already struggling to afford enough calories to survive. If you were working class, breakfast was probably porridge or gruel, oats or barley boiled with water, or that questionable milk we discussed. This had the advantage of being cheap and filling. It had the disadvantage of being incredibly boring, and if made in advance, becoming a congealed cement-like mass that had to be chiselled out of the pot. In summer, leftover porridge would develop a thin skin on top and a sour smell underneath. You'd scrape off the skin, reheat the rest, and pretend it was fine. Eggs were a luxury for many families, but if you could afford them, summer presented special challenges. Eggs spoil quickly in heat, and the Victorians had no reliable way to keep them cold. There was a test for freshness. Put the egg in water, and if it floats, it's gone bad. Of course, this test only works if you do it before cracking the egg into your pan. Many people learned the hard way that their egg was rotten only after releasing an unholy stench into their already hot kitchen. Speaking of kitchens, let's talk about cooking breakfast in summer heat. Most Victorian homes cooked on coal-burning ranges or open hearths. These had to be lit and kept burning if you wanted to cook anything or heat water. In summer, This meant deliberately creating a furnace in your home while it was already 80 degrees outside. The kitchen would easily reach 100 degrees or more. Cooking breakfast wasn't just food preparation, it was an endurance test. Working-class women would get up extra early to do the cooking before the day's heat peaked, which meant starting around 4 or 5 a.m. They'd light the fire, trying not to wake the rest of the family sleeping in nearby rooms, and then spend an hour hunched over a smoking, blazing hot stove in their already sweaty nightgowns. By the time breakfast was ready, they were drenched in sweat, covered in soot, and probably questioning their life choices. For those who could afford it, the breakfast spread was more elaborate but no less risky. The Victorian middle class liked to put on a good show at breakfast. Bacon, sausages, kippers, kidneys, eggs, toast, preserves. All of this sat out on the sideboard in warming dishes, kept tepid by little spirit lamps. In summer, this created a perfect bacteria breeding environment. The bacon would sit there, lukewarm and glistening with grease, while flies buzzed around trying to get their share. Those flies, by the way, were unavoidable. Victorian kitchens in summer were absolutely swarming with them. They'd land on your food, walk around on it with their dirty little feet, lay eggs in anything moist, and generally make every meal a test of how much insect contamination you could tolerate. Some families tried to cover food with mesh cloths, but flies are persistent, and mesh has holes. You learned to eat quickly, before too many flies made landing approaches on your plate. Preserves and jams offered some hope. Sugar is a natural preservative after all, but even these weren't safe. Open a jar of jam in summer and leave it on the table, and within hours you'd have a thin layer of mould forming on top. The Victorian solution: scrape off the mould and eat the jam underneath. Waste not, want not. The mould was probably the least dangerous thing you'd eat all day anyway. Tea was the saving grace of Victorian breakfast, and not just because it was Britain's national obsession. Boiling water killed most of the bacteria that made the water dangerous to drink in the first place. So even though your milk was questionable, your bread was weevil infested, and your butter had achieved liquid state, at least your tea was relatively safe. Unless, of course, the tea leaves themselves had been adulterated, which they often were, mixed with dried and recoloured used tea leaves, or bulked out with actual tree leaves that weren't tea at all. The final indignity of Victorian summer breakfast was that no matter how carefully you tried to eat, no matter how quickly you consumed your food, you'd end up sweating through your clothes. The hot tea, the warm food, the heat from the kitchen fire still burning in the next room, all of it combined to ensure that by the time you finished breakfast, you were already a sticky, uncomfortable mess. And you hadn't even left the house yet. So there you sat, at your breakfast table, consuming food that was part nutrition and part science experiment, sweating into your already dirty clothes, swatting at flies, and preparing yourself for a full day of work in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint on the spot. Bon appétit. Now comes the truly sadistic part: getting dressed. In the Victorian era, summer clothes didn't mean shorts and a tank top. It meant slightly fewer layers of wool, cotton and linen that still covered you from neck to ankle. Women had it particularly brutal. Picture this. You start with a chemise, add drawers, then a corset. Yes, even in summer. Then a corset cover, then petticoats, multiple petticoats, then finally your actual dress. Let's break down this torture session layer by layer, shall we? The chemise was your base layer, a long linen or cotton shift that went from your shoulders to your knees. This was the only thing between your skin and the rest of your clothing, which means by the end of a summer day, it would be completely soaked with sweat. Imagine wearing a damp t-shirt all day, except it's floor length, has long sleeves, and you can't take it off until bedtime. That's your chemise experience. Next came the drawers, essentially long underwear that tied at the waist and came down to your knees or ankles. These were split at the crotch for bathroom convenience, because trying to undo all those layers when nature called was already enough of a nightmare. The drawers were usually made of cotton or linen, which sounds breathable, until you remember you're wearing them under 6 other layers in 85-degree heat. They'd stick to your legs, bunch up uncomfortably, and create a special kind of chafing that would make walking a memorable experience. And then, the corset. The magnificent, rib-crushing, organ-rearranging corset. Victorian women wore these every single day, regardless of temperature, because appearing in public without one was considered as shocking as appearing naked. The corset was made of a heavy cotton or coutil, reinforced with strips of whalebone or steel, and laced so tightly that breathing became optional. In summer, wearing a corset was like strapping a portable sauna to your torso. The physics of corsets in heat are fascinating in the worst possible way. Your body's trying to cool itself through sweating, but the corset creates a sealed, compressed environment where sweat has nowhere to go. It just sits there, trapped between your skin and the fabric, marinating your midsection in your own moisture. The boning channels would collect sweat. The fabric would become stiff with salt, and if you didn't wash your corset regularly, which most women couldn't because they only owned one or two, it would develop a smell that could clear a room. Women frequently fainted in Victorian summers, and everyone blamed it on their delicate feminine constitutions. Wrong. They were fainting because they were oxygen-deprived, overheated, and literally compressed to the point where their internal organs couldn't function properly. It wasn't weak constitutions, it was attempted murder by fashion. Over the corset went a corset cover, a light layer designed to protect your dress from the sweat and oils that would inevitably seep through. Because heaven forbid your expensive outer dress gets stained by the physical realities of having a human body, the corset cover was usually white cotton or linen, which meant it would show every drop of perspiration, creating delightful damp patches that spread across your torso like a slow-motion science experiment. Then came the petticoats. Oh, the petticoats. In summer, a woman might only wear 2 or 3, instead of the 5 or 6 required in winter. These were full skirts that hung from your waist made of cotton or linen, designed to give your outer dress the proper shape and volume. They were hot, heavy, and collected dirt from dragging on the ground. Walking in summer petticoats was like wading through fabric swamps. They'd wrap around your legs, stick to your damp stockings, and generally make every step an exercise in frustration. The stockings, by the way, were wool or cotton held up by garters that dug into your thighs. Elastic hadn't been widely adopted yet, so you had ties or buttons keeping these things up. They'd roll down throughout the day, cutting off circulation, creating red marks on your legs, and adding yet another layer between your skin and any possible cooling breeze. Finally, you'd put on your actual dress. This was typically made of heavy cotton, wool or silk, with long sleeves, a high neckline and a skirt that brushed the ground. Summer dresses might be slightly lighter in colour or made of marginally thinner fabric, but the coverage requirements remained the same. Exposed arms, scandalous. A hint of collarbone, positively indecent. You were covered from neck to wrists to ankles, wrapped in multiple layers of increasingly sweaty fabric. The dress itself could weigh anywhere from 5 to 15 pounds, depending on the style and fabric. Add in the weight of your petticoats, corset, and all the other layers, and you're carrying around an extra 20 to 30 pounds of clothing. In summer. In heat that routinely topped 90 degrees. It's like going to the gym wearing a weighted vest, except you're not exercising. You're just trying to exist. Men had it slightly better, but only slightly. They started with a linen shirt, added an undershirt, then a vest or waistcoat, then a jacket, then trousers, all topped off with a collar that was essentially a neck prison. The Victorian collar was a separate piece, heavily starched, that attached to the shirt with studs. It was rigid, uncomfortable, and cut into your neck every time you turned your head. In summer heat, the starch would begin to wilt, turning your crisp collar into a damp, droopy necklace of suffering. Men's jackets were made of wool. Yes, wool, in summer. Because that's what respectable gentlemen wore. Taking off your jacket in public was considered rude and inappropriate, so men sweltered in their wool prisons, sweating through their shirts, undershirts and vests until they reached the privacy of their own homes. Office workers, shop clerks and businessmen all suffered in identical woolen misery, unified by their commitment to looking respectable while slowly cooking inside their clothes. The hat situation deserves special mention. Everyone wore hats outdoors. Everyone. Women wore elaborate bonnets or wide-brimmed hats decorated with flowers, ribbons, feathers, and occasionally entire taxidermied birds. These created a lovely greenhouse effect around your head, trapping heat and ensuring your scalp sweated profusely. Men wore top hats, bowler hats, or straw boaters, all of which sat on their heads like little ovens, baking their brains throughout the day. Gloves were another non-negotiable accessory. Ladies wore gloves outdoors to protect their hands from the sun and to maintain their delicate, pale complexions. Nothing says refined lady quite like hands that have never seen honest labour or sunlight. These gloves were made of kid leather or cotton, and they'd become sweaty, stained horror shows within hours. By the end of a summer day, peeling off your gloves felt like removing a second skin of a damp, wrinkled leather. The entire process of getting dressed could take 30 minutes to an hour, and that's if you were quick about it. Wealthy women had maids to help with the lacing, buttoning and pinning required to achieve a respectable appearance. Working-class women had to do it themselves, somehow reaching behind their backs to fasten dozens of tiny hooks and eyes while already running late for work. And here's the truly maddening part. Once you were dressed, you were committed. You couldn't just peel off layers when you got hot. Removing your jacket or loosening your collar in public would mark you as crude and lower class. Women certainly couldn't remove any layers without creating a scandal. You were stuck in your fabric prison until you returned home at the end of the day. By mid-morning, your clothes would already be damp with sweat. By afternoon, they'd be soaked. The armpits of your dress would darken with perspiration. Your collar would wilt. Your corset would chafe. Your stockings would slide down. And you'd still have hours to go before you could finally mercifully begin the lengthy process of removing all these layers and allowing your tortured skin to breathe. Victorian fashion in summer wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a daily reminder that society valued appearance over survival, propriety over comfort, and suffering in silence over admitting that maybe, just maybe, wearing 17 layers of fabric in 90-degree heat was a terrible idea. But at least you looked respectable while you slowly died. Stepping outside in Victorian summer was like walking into a wall of sensory assault. The streets weren't paved with good intentions. They were paved with horse manure, rotting vegetables, dead rats, and a special kind of mud that was part dirt, part sewage, and entirely disgusting. London alone had hundreds of thousands of horses pulling carriages, carts, and omnibuses. Each horse produced roughly 15 to 30 pounds of manure per day. Let's do the math on that, shall we? 300,000 horses times, let's say, 20 pounds of manure each equals 6 million pounds of horse waste, hitting London streets every single day. That's 3,000 tons. Daily. And in summer, when the heat turned everything into a fermenting biological weapon, those streets became a humanitarian crisis wrapped in a public health nightmare. The manure didn't just sit there in neat piles either. Carriage wheels crushed it, grinding it into a fine paste that mixed with dirt, dust, and whatever liquid waste was flowing through the gutters. In dry weather, this created clouds of what Victorians delicately called street dust, a polite term for pulverised horse faeces that would blow into your face, coat your clothes, settle in your hair, and occasionally make its way into your mouth if you were unlucky enough to breathe while walking. Nothing says civilised society quite like inhaling weaponised manure particles. When it rained, which it did because this was England, the streets transformed into rivers of liquid horror. The manure would mix with the rain, creating a thick, brown soup that flowed through the gutters and pooled in every low spot. This wasn't like stepping in a modern puddle. This was stepping into a biological stew that could soak through your shoes and stockings within seconds, leaving you walking around in manure-saturated footwear for the rest of the day. The smell would follow you everywhere, a personal aromatic reminder of your journey through Victorian urban planning. The crossing sweepers became heroes of the urban landscape. These were usually children or desperately poor adults who would rush out with brooms to sweep a path through the muck whenever someone well-dressed approached. For a penny or two, they'd clear you a relatively clean route across the street. The key word here is relatively. They couldn't actually remove all the filth. They could only push it aside temporarily, creating narrow islands of slightly less disgusting pavement that you could hop across. It was like playing the world's most revolting game of hopscotch. But horse manure was just the opening act in this symphony of stench. Let's talk about the gutters, those channels running along the edges of streets that were supposed to carry away rainwater. In practice, they carried away everything. Chamber pot contents tossed from windows, slaughterhouse runoff, the liquid waste from markets and shops, dead animals, rotting food, all of it flowed through the gutters in a slow-moving parade of horror. In summer, these gutters often dried to a trickle or stopped flowing entirely, creating stagnant pools of concentrated nightmare. The smell was indescribable. Imagine every bad smell you've ever encountered, blend them together, let them ferment in the sun for a week, and you're maybe halfway to understanding what a Victorian gutter smelled like in August. People would hold handkerchiefs or pomanders to their noses while walking, not because they were being delicate, but because breathing the unfiltered air could trigger immediate nausea. Market days added their own special layer to the street experience. Vendors would sell their goods from carts and stalls, and any unsold produce would simply be thrown into the street at day's end. Cabbage leaves, rotten fruit, fish heads, meat scraps, all of it joined the existing street debris. In summer heat, the decomposition process accelerated dramatically. Walk past a market area the morning after market day, and you'd encounter a smell that combined rotting vegetables, spoiled meat, and despair in equal measure. Dead animals were a common sight on Victorian streets, and in summer they became particularly problematic. A horse would collapse from heat exhaustion or overwork. This happened daily, and it might sit there for hours or even days before anyone removed it. Dogs, cats, rats, and various other creatures would die in the streets and gutters, their bodies bloating in the heat, attracting flies by the thousands, and creating smell zones that pedestrians would cross the street to avoid. Speaking of rats, they were everywhere. Victorian streets were rat paradise, unlimited food, water from the gutters, and countless hiding places in the crumbling infrastructure. The rats grew bold and fat, scurrying across streets in broad daylight, fighting over choice scraps of rotting food. In summer, when food spoiled quickly, the rat population exploded. Walking down a street at dusk, you'd see dozens of them emerging from their holes, a furry, squirming carpet of disease vectors going about their business. The flies might have been even worse than the rats. In summer, the fly population reached biblical proportions. They bred in the manure, the rotting food, the dead animals, the overflowing cesspits. Essentially, every surface of the Victorian city provided ideal fly nursery conditions. The air itself seemed to buzz and shimmer with them. They'd land on your face, crawl across your lips, walk around on your food, and generally make every outdoor experience a test of patience. Industrial districts added their own aromatic contributions to the urban bouquet. Tanneries, where leather was processed using dog feces and urine, created a smell so powerful that property values dropped in surrounding neighbourhoods. Slaughterhouses dumped blood and offal into the streets, creating sticky red streams that attracted every fly and rat within a mile radius. Factories pumped out chemical smoke that mixed with the organic street smells to create new, never-before-experienced olfactory atrocities. Even the nice parts of town weren't immune. Wealthy neighbourhoods had better drainage and more frequent street cleaning, but they still had horses, they still had gutters, and they still had summer heat turning everything into aromatic soup. The rich tried to insulate themselves with perfumes, sachets, and enclosed carriages. But even the finest carriage had to travel through the same streets as everyone else. The smell found a way in. The really maddening part was that Victorians had to pretend this was all perfectly normal. Ladies in their elaborate dresses would daintily lift their hems to avoid the worst of the street muck, carefully stepping over piles of manure and dead rats, while maintaining an expression of serene dignity. Gentlemen would tip their hats and make polite conversation while standing in what was essentially an open sewer, both parties tacitly agreeing to ignore the olfactory nightmare surrounding them. Children, bless them, had no such pretensions. They played in the streets because there was nowhere else to play. They'd run through the manure, splash in the gutters, chase the rats, and generally seem immune to the biological hazards surrounding them. Whether this built their immune systems or just exposed them to terrible diseases was a coin flip. Many didn't survive childhood, which probably tells you everything you need to know about Victorian street safety. The sound of the streets matched the smell. The constant clatter of a horse hooves on cobblestones, the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels, the shouts of vendors and drivers, the screams of children playing, and underneath it all the buzz of millions of flies. It was sensory overload in every possible way, a full-body assault on every sense you possessed. Street vendors would try to sell you food in these conditions. Meat pies, shellfish, fruit, all of it sitting out in the open, collecting street dust, Remember, pulverised manure, attracting flies, slowly cooking in the heat. The vendors would shout their wares enthusiastically, as if there was nothing unusual about selling food products in what was essentially an open-air biological warfare testing ground. By the time you reached your destination, work, market, wherever you were going, your shoes would be caked in street muck, your clothes would be coated in street dust, and your lungs would be full of air that had been filtered through several layers of decomposing organic matter. You'd smell like the streets, because the streets were inescapable. Everyone smelled like the streets. It was the universal Victorian perfume, the scent that united all social classes in shared aromatic misery. And you'd have to walk back through it all again at the end of the day. Welcome to Victorian urban planning, where the streets were paved with literally everything except good intentions. Thirsty yet? Well, you'd better hope not, because drinking water in a Victorian city during summer was basically playing Russian roulette with cholera. Most of London's water came from the Thames, which, as we've established, was an open sewer. Water companies would pump it out, maybe let it sit in a reservoir for a bit, and then send it through pipes directly into homes and public pumps. The concept of water treatment didn't really exist yet. The best you could hope for was that your water company practiced sedimentation, which meant letting the water sit still long enough for the chunks to settle to the bottom. The chunks. Let that sink in. There were visible, settleable chunks in the drinking water, and removing them was considered advanced purification technology. Different water companies served different parts of the city, and the quality varied wildly depending on where they drew their water from the Thames. The Southwark and Vauxhall Company, for example, had their intake pipe right in the heart of central London, downstream from countless sewage outlets. They were basically pumping liquid cholera directly to their customers. The Lambeth Company, after a particularly nasty cholera outbreak in 1854, moved their intake upstream, which reduced their customer death rate significantly. This was considered revolutionary thinking. Maybe don't pump sewage directly into people's drinking glasses. Public water pumps were community gathering spots, and disease distribution centres rolled into one. These pumps, often located in courtyards or at street corners, served hundreds of families. People would line up with their buckets and jugs, filling them from a shared spout that had been touched by countless unwashed hands. The pump mechanism itself was rarely cleaned, creating a nice bacterial colony right at the source. It was like a water fountain at a plague ward, except nobody knew what bacteria were yet, so they just blamed bad air and moral failings. The famous Broad Street pump outbreak of 1854 perfectly illustrates the drinking water crisis. A single contaminated pump killed over 600 people in a matter of days. Dr. John Snow figured out that the pump was the source, removed the handle, and the outbreak stopped. But here's the kicker. Many people didn't believe him. They thought it was coincidence. The miasma theory, bad air causes disease, was so entrenched that even direct evidence of water contamination couldn't shake people's faith in it. So they kept drinking from contaminated pumps, kept getting sick, and kept blaming the weather. If you were wealthy enough to have piped water in your home, congratulations, you had the privilege of disease-laden water delivered right to your kitchen. The pipes themselves were often made of lead, which added heavy metal poisoning to your list of beverage concerns. The pipes also leaked constantly, and since they ran through soil contaminated with sewage from cess pits, groundwater would seep in, bringing its own special blend of bacteria and parasites. Your clean piped water was often worse than what came from the public pump. The water that came out of these pipes and pumps wasn't just contaminated with sewage, it was alive with all sorts of microscopic horrors. Cholera bacteria, typhoid bacteria, dysentery-causing amoebas, various parasitic worms and countless other pathogens all swam merrily in Victorian drinking water. You couldn't see them. Microscopy was still in its infancy, and germ theory hadn't been widely accepted. But they were there, waiting to colonise your intestines and make you very, very sorry you got thirsty. In summer, the water crisis intensified dramatically. Lower river levels meant more concentrated sewage. Warmer temperatures meant bacteria multiplied faster. More people sweating meant more people drinking, which meant more people getting sick. Cholera outbreaks followed a predictable seasonal pattern, spiking every summer like deadly clockwork. Yet somehow, people still didn't make the connection. that maybe drinking water that smelled like sewage and tasted like pennies was a bad idea. Some Victorians tried to protect themselves through various methods, most of which didn't work. Boiling water did help, but it required fuel, time, and an understanding that heat killed germs, which most people didn't have. Some people added a bit of alcohol to their water, which they believed purified it. It didn't, but at least they died buzzed and hydrated. Others strained their water through cloth, which removed visible particles but did absolutely nothing about bacteria. It was the Victorian equivalent of thoughts and prayers, except with fabric. The wealthy had slightly more options. They could pay for water from companies that drew from supposedly cleaner sources. They could have servants boil all their drinking water. They could even buy bottled spring water, which became fashionable among the upper classes, though there was no guarantee that spring water wasn't just Thames water someone had bottled in their basement. Basically, the rich could spend money to marginally reduce their chances of dying from their drinking water, which is a pretty low bar for privilege. Working-class families had no such options. They drank what came from the public pump, and they drank it often because manual labour in summer heat meant constant dehydration. Factory workers, dock workers, street vendors, they'd all stop at pumps throughout the day, gulping down water that was slowly killing them. The alternative was dying of heat stroke, so really it was a choice between immediate death by dehydration or potential death by waterborne disease. Fun times. Children were particularly vulnerable. They couldn't understand why the water that looked clear might be dangerous, and they had less developed immune systems to fight off infections. Kids would play in the streets all day in summer heat, get desperately thirsty, and drink from the nearest pump without a second thought. Parents would dilute milk with pump water to make it go further, inadvertently creating a disease delivery beverage for their infants. Child mortality rates spiked every summer, and water was a major culprit. The taste of Victorian city water varied from slightly off to actively trying to escape the glass. People would describe it as metallic, musty, or having a peculiar flavour that polite society didn't discuss in detail. Some water literally smelled like sewage, and people still drank it because the alternative was dying of thirst. They'd try to mask the taste with tea, coffee, or sugar, but you can only do so much to disguise liquid death. Ice was theoretically an option for cooling water, but ice in Victorian summers was expensive, hard to come by, and often just as contaminated as the water it was supposed to cool. Ice was harvested from rivers and ponds in winter, the same rivers and ponds that were contaminated with sewage, then stored in ice houses where it could pick up additional bacteria and dirt. So your attempt to make your water more palatable might actually make it more dangerous. Victorian life was full of these delightful ironies. Some neighbourhoods had wells instead of pumps, which people believed were safer because the water came from underground rather than the river. They were wrong. Wells were often dug right next to cesspits, allowing sewage to leach directly into the groundwater. The well water would be cold and clear, which seemed pure, but it was often more concentrated with bacteria than river water. It was like choosing between two different flavours of cholera. Beer and gin became safer alternatives to water, which explains a lot about Victorian society. Even children drank small beer, a weak low-alcohol brew, because it had been boiled during production, making it less likely to kill you than straight water. The stereotypical image of Victorian gin-soaked poverty wasn't just about alcoholism, it was survival strategy. When your drinking water options are Thames sewage or fermented beverages start looking pretty reasonable. The really horrifying part is how long this situation persisted. Cholera outbreaks happened regularly throughout the mid-1800s. Thousands died. Scientists published papers about water contamination. Doctors begged authorities to improve the water supply. And yet, meaningful change took decades. The Great Stink of 1858 finally motivated Parliament to fund proper sewage systems, but even then it took years to build them. Multiple generations of Victorians lived and died without access to clean drinking water in one of the wealthiest cities in the world. So when you stand in your kitchen, turn on your tap, and fill a glass with clean, cold, bacteria-free water, take a moment to appreciate the miracle of modern sanitation. Because for your great-great-great-grandparents, getting a drink of water without risking death was a luxury beyond imagining. Stay hydrated, friends. Just maybe not in 1858 London. Now it's time to work, because in Victorian England you didn't get summer vacation. You got up, put on your suffocating clothes, and dragged yourself to whatever miserable job kept you from starving. If you worked in a factory, congratulations. You got to spend 12 to 14 hours in a building with no air conditioning, no ventilation, and machinery that generated enough heat to make you wonder if you'd accidentally wandered into hell. Factory work in Victorian summer was a special kind of torture that would violate roughly 17 modern workplace safety regulations per minute. Textile mills were particularly nightmarish. The machinery, massive looms, spinning frames and carding engines generated tremendous heat through friction and the steam power that drove them. The air would be thick with cotton or wool fibres, creating a hot, fuzzy fog that coated your lungs with every breath. Temperatures inside textile mills regularly reached 100 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was considered normal working conditions. But here's where it gets even worse. The windows were kept closed on purpose. Mill owners discovered that humid air kept the threads from breaking as easily, so they'd actually spray water into the air and seal the windows to trap the moisture inside. You were essentially working in a hot, humid terrarium, breathing air that was part oxygen, part textile fibre, and part despair. Workers would emerge at the end of their shifts soaked with sweat, covered in fibre dust, and wondering if they'd survive another day. The noise was deafening. Hundreds of machines clattering away in enclosed spaces created a wall of sound so intense that workers couldn't hear each other speak. They developed elaborate systems of hand signals and lip reading just to communicate. The combination of heat, noise, and poor air quality would give you a splitting headache within the first hour, and you still had 11 more hours to go. There were no breaks except for a brief lunch period, during which you'd be too exhausted and heat-sick to actually eat anything. Iron workers and foundry workers had it even worse, if you can imagine. These men worked with molten metal in buildings that were basically giant ovens. The furnaces had to run constantly, regardless of outdoor temperature, because letting them cool down and reheating them was too expensive. So in summer, you'd have furnaces radiating 2,000-degree heat in buildings that were already sweltering from the sun. Workers would stand as close as they could to these infernos, pouring molten iron or steel, their faces protected only by cloth masks that did absolutely nothing. The heat from the furnaces was so intense that men would sometimes spontaneously combust. Their clothing would catch fire from radiant heat alone. Burns were an everyday occurrence. Men would develop huge blisters that would pop and weep throughout their shifts, and they'd just keep working because stopping meant losing a day's wages. They'd drink enormous quantities of water from whatever source was available, not realising they were replacing the fluids they were sweating out with bacteria-laden disease water. Many iron workers simply collapsed from heat stroke and were dragged outside to recover or die, whichever came first. Laundresses, the women who washed clothes for wealthier families, worked in perhaps the most ironically uncomfortable conditions. They spent their days in steamy, sweltering laundry rooms, boiling enormous vats of water, scrubbing clothes by hand, and operating heavy irons heated on stoves. The rooms would be filled with steam, making the air so thick you could barely breathe. Temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees. These women would be drenched in sweat from head to toe, their hands raw and blistered from the harsh lye soap and constant submersion in hot water. The irons they used weighed several pounds and had to be repeatedly reheated on the stove. Imagine holding a 7-pound piece of metal, heated to several hundred degrees, inches from your face, in a room that's already 115 degrees for 10 to 12 hours straight. Laundresses had some of the shortest life expectancies of any occupation, which tells you everything you need to know about the job. Bakers worked through the night and into the early morning, trying to finish their work before the day's heat peaked. But bakery ovens had to be fired regardless of temperature, and small bakery shops would transform into furnaces. Bakers would work stripped to the waist, which was considered shocking and improper, but was the only way to survive the heat. Even so, many would pass out from heat exhaustion. The bread you bought in the morning was quite possibly made by someone hallucinating from heat stroke. Shop clerks and office workers, while spared the worst of industrial heat, had their own summer miseries. Shops were stuffy, airless boxes with large windows that magnified the sun's heat like a greenhouse. Clerks wore their full formal attire, jacket, vest, collar and all, because appearing before customers in anything less was unthinkable. They'd stand behind counters for 12 to 14 hours, slowly baking in their wool cocoons, forbidden from loosening their collars or removing their jackets even when no customers were present. Office workers sat at desks in crowded rooms with poor ventilation, copying documents by hand for hours on end. The upper floors of office buildings where the clerks worked were always the hottest. Heat rises, after all, and Victorian buildings weren't designed with air circulation in mind. The combination of body heat from dozens of workers, poor ventilation, and summer sun beating down on the roof created working conditions that would make a sauna jealous. Men would occasionally faint at their desks and were expected to return to work as soon as they regained consciousness. Outdoor workers faced a different but equally brutal challenge. Construction workers, dock workers, street pavers, and labourers worked directly in the sun with no shade, no sunscreen, and no real breaks. They'd haul bricks, unload ships, break rocks, and dig ditches in full sun while wearing heavy work clothes and boots. Heatstroke was common enough that it barely warranted comment. A man would collapse, his co-workers would drag him into whatever shade they could find, pour some water on him, and get back to work. If he recovered, great. If he didn't, someone else would take his position the next day. The pace of work never slowed for the heat. Factory owners and foremen didn't care if it was 95 degrees outside. Production quotas remained the same. In fact, some managers pushed workers even harder in summer, trying to make up for any productivity lost to heat-related collapses. The attitude was essentially work faster to finish before you die of heat stroke. It was motivational, if nothing else. There was no such thing as a heat day. No employer sent workers home when temperatures became dangerous. The concept of workplace safety related to temperature didn't exist. You either worked through the heat or you lost your job, and losing your job meant you and your family might starve. So people pushed through, ignoring the warning signs of heat exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, confusion, muscle cramps, until they literally couldn't continue. Drinking water at work was often scarce and always suspect. Factories might have a single pump or barrel that all workers shared, refilled irregularly, often contaminated. Workers would gulp down warm, stale water during their brief breaks, grateful for anything liquid even if it tasted like pennies and death. Some workers brought their own water from home, which meant carrying heavy containers all day in addition to their tools and lunch. The clothing requirements alone were enough to cause heat casualties. Even the poorest workers were expected to maintain some level of respectability. Men wore long pants, long-sleeved shirts, and often vests or jackets. Women wore full dresses with petticoats underneath. There was no such thing as casual Friday or dress-down summer policies. You dressed properly or you were sent home without pay for being indecent. Lunch breaks, when they existed, offered little relief. Workers would stumble out of their sweltering workplaces into the sweltering streets, perhaps buy some questionable food from a street vendor, and sit in whatever patch of shade they could find. 30 minutes to an hour later, they'd drag themselves back inside for another 6 to 8 hours of heat-soaked misery. The afternoon shift was always worse because the buildings had spent the morning absorbing heat, turning into massive brick ovens by 2 p.m. Some workers developed coping strategies. Factory workers would splash themselves with water from any available source, not caring if it was clean. Outdoor workers would soak rags and tie them around their heads. Bakers would drink beer throughout their shifts, both for hydration and to dull the misery. None of these strategies actually made the work safe or comfortable. They just made it slightly more survivable. The statistics are grim. Heat-related deaths spiked every summer, though they were rarely recorded as such. A worker who collapsed and died was more likely to be listed as dying from heart failure, or natural causes, rather than heat stroke. This made the problem seem less severe than it actually was, which meant no pressure to improve working conditions. Out of sight, out of mind, except for the families who lost their primary breadwinner to something as preventable as overheating. By the end of a summer workday, you were a shadow of yourself. Dehydrated, exhausted, possibly sunburned or heat-sick, definitely smelling like the world's worst gymnasium. And you'd have to do it all again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day until either winter arrived or you died, whichever came first. There were no labour laws protecting workers from heat exposure, no mandatory breaks in air-conditioned spaces, no requirements for employers to provide clean drinking water, nothing. You were expected to work until the job was done, regardless of temperature, and if you couldn't handle it, there were plenty of desperate people willing to take your place. Welcome to Victorian workplace wellness programs, where wellness meant still alive at the end of your shift. Let's talk about the children, because Victorian summer didn't spare them either. Kids as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories, mines and workshops right alongside adults. They crawled through narrow coal mine tunnels in stifling heat, operated dangerous machinery in textile mills, and swept chimneys in temperatures that would make a modern OSHA inspector weep. The Victorian logic behind child labour was simple and horrifying. Children were small, cheap and disposable. Their tiny hands could reach into machinery that adults couldn't access. Their small bodies could fit into spaces grown workers couldn't navigate, and they could be paid a fraction of adult wages, sometimes just a few pennies per day, which made them incredibly attractive to factory owners who valued profit over, not killing children. In textile mills, children as young as 5 worked as scavengers, crawling under operating machinery to collect loose cotton fibres. The machines never stopped, so these kids were essentially playing a deadly game of human Frogger, dodging moving parts while inhaling fibre-filled air in 100-degree heat. If they weren't quick enough, they'd lose fingers, hands, or their lives. The mill owners considered this an acceptable business cost. After all, there were always more poor children desperate for work. The older children, maybe 8 to 12 years old, worked as piecers, tying together broken threads on the spinning machines. They'd run back and forth for 12 to 14 hours, reaching into moving machinery, their small fingers working frantically to keep up with the mechanical pace. In summer, these children would be drenched in sweat within an hour, their clothes sticking to their bodies, their vision blurring from heat exhaustion and the constant fibre dust in the air. Fainting was common, getting back up and continuing to work was expected. Child coal miners had it even worse, if you can fathom such a thing. These kids worked as trappers, sitting in the darkness of mine tunnels for up to 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors when they heard coal carts approaching. Imagine being 6 years old, sitting alone in pitch blackness hundreds of feet underground, in stifling heat and darkness, with only rats for company. The mine tunnels in summer could reach temperatures of 90 to 100 degrees, with humidity levels near 100%. It was like being trapped inside someone's lung. Older children, the hurriers, or thrusters, crawled through low tunnels pulling or pushing coal carts that weighed hundreds of pounds. They'd wear leather harnesses attached to chains, crawling on their hands and knees like animals through passages sometimes only 2 feet high. Their knees would bleed, their backs would permanently deform from the constant crouching, and the heat would drain every ounce of energy from their small bodies. Many developed respiratory diseases from breathing coal dust in the heat. Most didn't live to see adulthood. Chimney sweeps were perhaps the most visible symbols of Victorian child labour horror. Master sweeps would send boys, some as young as 4 or 5, up narrow chimneys to brush away soot build-up. Summer was actually their busiest season because wealthy families wanted their chimneys cleaned before winter. These children would climb up dark, narrow flues, sometimes getting stuck, sometimes suffocating, always terrified. The chimneys would retain heat from previous fires. And in summer, they'd also be baking in the sun, turning into vertical ovens. The boys would emerge covered in soot, their lungs permanently damaged, their growth stunted from malnutrition and the toxic chemicals in the soot. Many developed chimney sweeps cancer, a scrotal cancer caused by prolonged exposure to chimney soot. They were literally being poisoned and cooked alive for pennies per day, and society just accepted this. Some chimney sweeps were so small that they'd send them up while the chimney was still warm to encourage them to work faster. That encouragement was literally climb or burn. Street vendors' children had a different but still brutal summer experience. These kids would walk miles every day selling flowers, matches, newspapers, or whatever goods their families could scrape together. They'd stand on hot cobblestones in bare feet or shoes with holes, holding heavy baskets, calling out their wares for hours in the blazing sun. No shade, no water breaks, no protection from the heat. They'd start before dawn and work until after dark, covering the same streets over and over, hoping to sell enough to avoid a beating when they got home. The pure finders, children who collected dog feces to sell to tanneries, worked through the summer heat searching through street waste. They'd wade through the muck in bare feet, picking through garbage and excrement in 90-degree temperatures, collecting their finds in buckets they carried all day. The smell alone was enough to make grown adults vomit. But these kids did it daily because the alternative was starvation. Summer meant the feces dried out faster, which was somehow both better and worse. Better because it was easier to collect, worse because it created a fine dust that the children would breathe in all day. Factory owners loved summer for child labour because children were less likely to complain about the heat than adults. Kids didn't know that working conditions could be different. If they'd been doing this since age 5, they thought everyone worked in these conditions. They'd pushed themselves to the point of collapse because they didn't understand the warning signs of heat stroke. They'd work through dizziness, nausea and confusion, thinking they were just weak or lazy, not realising their bodies were shutting down. The workday for children was often longer than for adults. Why? Because children could be sent to run errands, clean up, or prepare for the next day after the main work was done. A child factory worker might arrive at 5 am to help start up the machines, work until 7 p.m. on the factory floor, then spend another hour cleaning before finally being released. That's 14 hours of work for someone whose age is still in single digits. Breaks were minimal to non-existent. Some factories allowed a 30-minute break for lunch, during which children were expected to eat whatever stale bread or spoiled food they'd brought from home, drink from contaminated pumps, and rest enough to survive another 6 hours of work. Many children were too exhausted to eat. Some would fall asleep during their break and have to be physically shaken awake when work resumed. Sleeping on the job could result in beatings or wage deductions, so kids learned to work through the exhaustion even when their small bodies were begging for rest. The clothing situation for working children was particularly dire. Most had only one outfit, often threadbare and too small because they'd outgrown it and their families couldn't afford replacements. They'd wear the same clothes every single day in summer heat, never washing them because they had no alternatives. The clothes would become stiff with sweat, dirt and whatever substances they worked with. Coal dust, textile fibres, chemical residues. The smell was unimaginable, and the chafing from wearing crusty, sweaty clothes for 14 hours a day caused sores and infections. Child workers in glass factories faced particularly extreme heat exposure. Glass had to be worked at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and children as young as 8 would work as carry-in boys, transporting molten glass from furnaces to workbenches. They'd run back and forth through extreme heat, their faces permanently reddened from the radiant heat, their hands scarred from inevitable burns. In summer, the factory temperatures would be unbearable, but the work pace never slowed. Speed was essential in glasswork, and children who moved too slowly would be beaten or fired. Match factories employed thousands of children in conditions that were both hot and toxic. The children would dip wooden sticks into white phosphorus, then dry them in heated rooms. Summer heat meant the drying rooms became even hotter than usual. The white phosphorus fumes in the heat would cause a condition called phossy jaw, where the jawbone would literally rot and glow in the dark. Children would lose their teeth, their jaws, and eventually their lives. The factories knew this happened. They kept hiring children anyway because they were cheap. Agricultural work in summer was equally brutal for children. Farmers' kids worked alongside their parents in the fields from dawn to dusk, with no regard for heat or exhaustion. They'd pick crops in full sun, carry heavy loads, operate dangerous farm equipment, all while wearing whatever clothes they owned. Heat exhaustion was common, heat stroke was frequent, and death from overheating was just considered part of farm life. Nobody kept statistics on how many children died in the fields each summer, but anecdotal evidence suggests it was heartbreakingly common. Some children worked in brick yards, making bricks by hand in the summer sun. They'd mix clay, form bricks, and carry them to drying racks, working in mud that was heated by the sun to temperatures that would blister their feet. The clay dust mixed with sweat would coat their skin, creating a paste that trapped heat against their bodies. They'd work until their hands bled, until they collapsed, until they simply couldn't continue. Then they'd be sent home without pay for the day they'd missed. Education reformers and social activists were beginning to document these conditions, but change came painfully slowly. The Factory Acts of the mid-1800s started to limit child labour, but enforcement was practically non-existent and loopholes were enormous. A law might say children under 9 couldn't work in textile mills, but it didn't stop them from working in mines, chimneys, or the dozens of other dangerous trades. And even when laws existed, factory owners simply lied about children's ages or bribed inspectors to look the other way. The children themselves had no voice, no advocates, no way to protest their treatment. They couldn't unionise, couldn't strike, couldn't complain without risking beatings and job loss. Many didn't even realise their situation was unusual. If you'd been working since age 5, you thought this was just what life was. The concept of childhood as a protected time of play and education was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. For working-class kids, childhood meant smaller hands for dangerous jobs and lower wages for the same deadly work. By the end of a summer day, working children would stumble home exhausted beyond measure, too tired to play, too tired sometimes to eat. They'd collapse onto whatever sleeping surface their family had, often just a pile of rags on the floor, and sleep for a few hours before starting the whole nightmare over again. Many didn't survive to adulthood. Those who did often carried permanent physical and psychological scars from their childhood of labour. This was Victorian childhood for the poor. No summer vacations, no trips to the seaside, no ice cream or games or lazy afternoons, just work, heat, exhaustion, and the distant hope that maybe someday something might change. Spoiler, it did eventually change. But for these children, eventually came too late. If you thought Victorian summer was bad in a middle-class neighbourhood, wait until you see the slums. These were packed, airless. Disease-ridden warrens where families of 8 or 10 crammed into single rooms with no windows, no ventilation, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbour's tuberculosis cough. The slums weren't just poor neighbourhoods. They were architectural manifestations of human despair. Buildings were constructed as cheaply as possible, often by landlords who'd never set foot in them, designed to squeeze maximum rent from minimum space. A single house might be divided into 20 or 30 rooms, each barely large enough to lie down in. These weren't apartments in any modern sense. They were spaces carved out of larger spaces, separated by thin boards or curtains, creating a honeycomb of human misery. In summer, these cramped quarters became ovens. The buildings were constructed of brick and wood with no thought given to ventilation or air circulation. Heat would build up during the day and radiate from the walls all night long, never giving residents a moment of relief. If you were lucky enough to have a window, it probably faced a narrow alley only a few feet wide, meaning you'd get no breeze, just the concentrated stench from the neighbours across the way. Most rooms had no windows at all. You lived in a dark, hot box, and the only air circulation came from the gaps in the walls, which also happened to let in rats, insects, and your neighbours' diseases. The population density in slums was almost incomprehensible by modern standards. In London's worst neighbourhoods, you might have 50 people living in a building meant for one family. The arithmetic of misery was simple. More bodies meant more body heat, more breathing meant less oxygen, more people meant more waste and fewer resources to deal with it. In summer, the temperature inside these buildings would be significantly higher than outside, sometimes by 10 or 15 degrees. You were essentially living inside a biological furnace fueled by human suffering. Privacy was a joke. Families shared single rooms, but family was a loose term that might include blood relatives, lodgers who paid a few pennies to sleep on the floor, and random people who had nowhere else to go. You'd have grandparents, parents, children, and strangers all sleeping within arm's reach of each other. In summer heat, everyone would be stripped down to their undergarments, sweating on top of each other, trying to sleep while being actively cooked by their neighbours' body heat. The sleeping arrangements were creative in the worst possible way. The most fortunate had actual beds, which they'd share with multiple family members, sleeping head to toe like human sardines. Others slept on the floor, maybe with a thin straw mattress if they were lucky, more often just on bare floorboards with a rag for a blanket. Some slums had penny hangs, where for a penny you could sleep leaning over a rope strung across the room. Yes, you read that correctly. People paid money to drape themselves over a rope and attempt to sleep while standing up. In the morning, the rope would be cut and everyone would fall over, which was your wake-up call. Victorian innovation at its finest. The heat made everything worse, every smell intensified. Every sensation became unbearable. In a middle-class home you might have stale air and body odour. In the slums you had those plus the smell of raw sewage from overflowing cesspits, rotting food from the communal garbage heap in the courtyard, unwashed bodies living in close proximity, diseased neighbours too poor to seek treatment, and the general miasma of poverty concentrated into spaces too small to contain it. Breathing felt like inhaling visible stench. Water access in slum buildings was nightmarish. An entire building might have one pump in the courtyard, turned on for only a few hours per day. When it was operating, you'd see dozens of people lined up with buckets and jugs fighting to fill their containers before the water shut off. The water itself came from questionable sources, shallow wells dug too close to cesspits, or connections to the municipal supply that were so far downstream they barely trickled. In summer, when water usage peaked, the pressure would drop to almost nothing. You might wait an hour for enough water to fill a single bucket. That precious water had to serve every need. Drinking, cooking, washing yourself, washing clothes, cleaning your living space, all from the same bucket. Most people prioritised drinking and cooking because the alternative was immediate death. Washing yourself came last, if at all. Laundry was an irregular occurrence. Cleaning your room was nearly impossible when you had no water to spare and nowhere to put the dirt anyway. The result was living spaces that accumulated layers of grime, creating ecosystems that would fascinate biologists and horrify everyone else. The toilets, and let's be generous with that term, were shared among dozens of families. A typical slum building might have one or two privies in the back courtyard, serving 50 to 100 people. In summer, these facilities went from terrible to apocalyptic. The heat accelerated decomposition, the pits overflowed, and the smell became weaponized. People would avoid using them until absolutely necessary, which meant chamber pots in the rooms, which meant even more concentrated smell in already suffocating spaces. The privies themselves were nightmares made solid. Just holes over pits that were supposed to be emptied regularly, but never were. The pits would overflow, creating a lake of sewage in the courtyard that everyone had to navigate to reach the building. In summer, flies would breed in these pools by the millions, creating black clouds of disease vectors that would invade every room in the building. Using the privy meant braving the flies, the smell, and the very real risk of falling into the pit if the boards rotted through. Children growing up in slum conditions in summer faced a survival rate that was essentially a coin flip. Infant mortality in the worst slum neighbourhoods could reach 50% or higher. Summer was particularly deadly because the heat accelerated the spread of every possible disease. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis, measles, scarlet fever. All of these thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of slum life. A single sick child could infect an entire building within days. The buildings themselves were falling apart, but landlords had no incentive to maintain them. Why fix a building when desperate people would live in it regardless? Roofs leaked, letting rain pour directly into top-floor rooms. Floors sagged and sometimes collapsed, sending families crashing into the room below. Walls developed cracks that let in wind and rain, but never cool breezes, because physics apparently had a personal grudge against the poor. In summer, the sun would beat down on failing roofs, turning the top floors into ovens where the temperature could exceed 110 degrees. Cooking in slum rooms was an adventure in heat management and fire safety. Most families had a small coal stove or brazier, which they'd use to prepare the limited food they could afford. In summer, lighting this stove meant adding even more heat to an already sweltering room, but the alternative was eating everything raw, which was a quick path to food poisoning. So you'd light your fire, cook your meagre meal as quickly as possible, and then suffer through the additional heat while you ate. The food available to slum dwellers was the worst quality at the highest prices. Local shops knew their customers had no alternatives, so they sold the most dubious merchandise imaginable. Meat that was already going off, milk watered down to transparency, bread bulked with sawdust and chalk. In summer this food spoiled even faster, but slum dwellers couldn't afford to throw anything away. They'd eat meat that smelled questionable, drink milk that had turned, and hope their stomachs could handle it. Many couldn't. Employment opportunities for slum residents were limited to the most dangerous and lowest paying work. Casual labour, dock work, street selling, rag picking, jobs with no security, no benefits, and pay that barely covered rent. In summer, when physical work became even more dangerous due to heat, these workers had no choice but to push through. Missing a day meant missing rent money, which meant eviction, which meant the street. The street was somehow worse than the slum, which tells you everything you need to know. Nighttime in the slums brought no relief. As the sun set and darkness fell, the temperature inside the buildings would remain high, trapped by the day's accumulated heat. People would lie awake, sweating, listening to the sounds of dozens of other families also lying awake and sweating. Babies would cry, adults would argue, someone would have a coughing fit that suggested tuberculosis. Rats would scurry across the floors and walls. Sleep, when it came, was fitful and unsatisfying. Some people would try to sleep outside in the courtyards or streets during the hottest nights, figuring the risk of robbery or assault was worth the chance of catching a breeze. Entire families would camp out on cobblestones, using walls as backrests, trying to find any position that might allow a few hours of rest. Police would occasionally rouse these outdoor sleepers, moving them along for vagrancy, forcing them back into their stifling rooms or into constant motion through the streets. The psychological toll of slum life in summer was immense. Imagine coming home after 12 hours of brutal physical labour in the heat, only to find your home is hotter than your workplace. Your children are sick. Your neighbour is dying of cholera. The smell is unbearable. The heat is inescapable. There's no water for washing, no money for better food, no hope of things improving. Day after day, week after week, summer stretching ahead like an endless sentence. Disease spread through slum buildings like wildfire in dry grass. One person would contract cholera from the contaminated water pump, and within a week half the building would be sick. Summer cholera outbreaks in the slums could kill hundreds in a matter of days. Bodies would be carried out regularly, sometimes left in courtyards until someone official came to collect them, decomposing in the heat, while children played nearby because there was nowhere else to play. Social reformers who visited the slums in summer would emerge pale and shaken, struggling to describe what they'd witnessed. Charles Dickens wrote about them. Henry Mayhew documented them. Reformers photographed them, but descriptions and pictures couldn't capture the physical reality of the heat, the smell, the crushing sense of being trapped in a place where summer wasn't a season, but a slow-motion disaster that killed the most vulnerable and left the survivors traumatized. The slums weren't just poverty. They were poverty concentrated, distilled, and baked in summer heat, until it became something almost unbearable to contemplate. They were proof that in Victorian England, your chances of surviving summer depended almost entirely on how much money you had. And if you had none, summer was just another way the world reminded you that you didn't matter. Welcome to where summer went to die, taking thousands of people with it every single year. Summer in Victorian cities meant you were never alone. You had company everywhere you went, and that company had 6 legs, a tail, or both. Flies descended on Victorian cities like biblical plagues. They bred in the mountains of horse manure piling up in every street, in the overflowing cesspits behind every building, in the rotting food at market stalls. The sheer number of flies in a Victorian summer city defies modern comprehension. We're not talking about a few annoying buzzing insects. We're talking about clouds of flies so thick they darken windows. Swarms so dense you'd inhale them if you weren't careful. The Victorian summer fly population numbered in the billions, and every single one of them seemed personally invested in landing on your face, your food, and every open wound they could find. Flies weren't just annoying. They were disease delivery systems with wings. They'd land on human waste in the cesspits, picking up cholera and typhoid bacteria on their little hairy legs. Then they'd fly over to the butcher's shop and walk around on the meat. Next stop, the baker's window display where they'd deposit their bacterial cargo on the bread. Then maybe a quick visit to your dinner plate where they'd vomit on your food to help digest it before eating. This was their daily routine, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop them. Every room in every building was infested with flies in summer. You'd wake up to flies crawling on your face. You'd eat breakfast while swatting flies away from your food. At work, flies would land on your hands, your papers, your tools. Walking down the street meant flies bouncing off your face like tiny disease-carrying bumper cars. By the end of a summer day, you'd have killed dozens of flies and barely made a dent in the population. Victorian attempts at fly control were charmingly ineffective. Fly paper, sticky strips coated with a sweet substance, would hang from ceilings in shops and homes. These would quickly become covered with trapped flies, creating a disturbing mobile of buzzing, dying insects. The sound of hundreds of flies struggling on the sticky paper was its own special form of torture. And the sight of the paper, black with accumulated fly corpses, was enough to make you question whether the cure was worse than the disease. Some people tried to keep flies out by covering windows with cloth or mesh, which worked great for keeping flies out and also for turning your home into an airless suffocation chamber. Others kept all food covered with mesh domes or cloths, which the flies would simply land on top of, waiting patiently for you to lift the cover. The flies always won. Always! Then there were the rats. Victorian cities were absolutely crawling with them. Estimates suggest that London had as many rats as people, maybe more. In summer, when food waste piled up faster and water sources were more accessible, the rat population exploded. They were everywhere, in the walls, in the sewers, in the streets, in the markets, in your home. You couldn't escape them. Victorian rats were bold. They'd gotten used to humans and had lost most of their natural fear. They'd scurry across streets in broad daylight, fight with cats over scraps, and occasionally bite people who got too close to their territories. At night, they were even more brazen. You'd hear them in the walls, scratching and squeaking. Sometimes you'd wake up to find one sitting on your bed, staring at you, judging your life choices. The sewers were rat metropolises. The new sewer systems that were slowly being built in Victorian cities created perfect rat habitats. Dark, moist, full of food waste, with plenty of running water. Sewer workers would report seeing rats the size of cats, swimming through the tunnels in vast packs. These super rats had adapted to sewer life so well they'd become a distinct population, larger and more aggressive than their above-ground cousins. Rats in markets were a constant problem. Food vendors would set up their stalls and within minutes rats would appear, bold as brass, helping themselves to the merchandise. Some vendors would keep cats or dogs to chase the rats away, which worked until the rats figured out they could just wait for the animals to get distracted. Smart rats would create diversions. One would distract the cat while others stole food. Victorian rats had developed team-based heist strategies. The worst part about rats wasn't seeing them. It was knowing they were there when you couldn't see them. You'd hear them scratching in the walls at night. You'd find their droppings in your kitchen in the morning. You'd discover that they'd chewed through your stored food, your clothes, your furniture. Rats needed to constantly gnaw to keep their teeth from growing too long, so they'd chew through almost anything. Wood, fabric, leather, even soft metals, all fair game for Victorian rats. Rat bites were common and terrifying. Rats carried diseases, though Victorians didn't understand exactly which diseases or how they spread them, and their bites would often become infected. Children sleeping on floors were particularly vulnerable. There are documented cases of infants being bitten by rats while sleeping, sometimes seriously injured. Parents in slums would have to take turns staying awake to guard their children from rat attacks. Cats were supposed to be the solution to the rat problem, but in reality, Victorian rats were often too large and aggressive for cats to handle. A well-fed house cat might catch the occasional mouse, but a street rat could go toe-to-toe with most cats and win. Some people kept terrier dogs specifically bred for ratting, which were more effective but also meant keeping a high-energy dog in your already crowded home. Bedbugs were another summer special. These tiny parasites lived in the cracks of bed frames and walls, coming out at night to feed on sleeping humans. Summer warmth made them more active and accelerated their breeding cycles. A Victorian bed could contain thousands of bedbugs, creating a nightmare scenario where going to sleep meant being slowly drained of blood by an army of insects. The bites were intensely itchy and would cover your body in red welts. You'd wake up covered in bites, your sheets dotted with blood spots, either from crushed bedbugs or from scratching the bites open in your sleep. There was no effective treatment. People tried washing their bed frames with kerosene, sprinkling them with sulphur, or even dousing them with boiling water. Nothing really worked. The bedbugs always came back. Lice were universal. Head lice, body lice, pubic lice. The Victorians had them all. Poor hygiene, infrequent washing of clothes and bedding, and crowded living conditions created perfect lice habitats. In summer, when people sweated more, the lice thrived. You'd see people scratching constantly, which was so common it barely warranted comment. Having lice wasn't a sign of being dirty, it was just part of existence. Removing lice was a time-consuming process that involved fine-toothed combs, endless patience, and usually help from a family member. Working-class mothers would spend their evenings going through their children's hair, picking out lice in their eggs, nits, crushing them between thumbnails. The satisfying pop of a crushed louse was a small victory in an unwinnable war. Fleas were constant companions, jumping from person to person, from pets to humans, from the street to your home. They'd hide in clothes, bedding and furniture, biting you throughout the day and night. The bites were itchy and could become infected if scratched too vigorously. Some people developed allergies to flea bites, covering themselves in raised red welts that looked like a plague symptom. Cockroaches thrived in Victorian cities, especially in the warmth of summer. They'd infest kitchens, pantries, and any space where food was stored. You'd light a candle at night and see them scurrying across walls and floors, disappearing into cracks too small to see. They'd contaminate food, leave droppings everywhere, and generally make every meal a gamble with food safety. Victorian homes had moths, silverfish, carpet beetles, and a host of other insects that would destroy your possessions while you slept. Clothes moths would lay eggs in your wool garments, and their larvae would eat holes through your limited wardrobe. Carpet beetles would chew through carpets and upholstery. Silverfish would consume paper, including important documents, books, and wallpaper. Mosquitoes in the summer were another menace. Victorian London had plenty of standing water, in barrels, in puddles, in the countless small ponds and ditches throughout the city. Mosquitoes bred prolifically, and summer evenings were filled with their high-pitched whining. They'd bite exposed skin, leaving itchy whelps that you'd scratch until they bled. Some mosquitoes carried diseases, though Victorians didn't understand the connection between mosquito bites and illnesses like malaria. Wasps and hornets built nests in buildings and would defend them aggressively in summer. Getting stung was painful and sometimes dangerous. People could have severe allergic reactions, though the Victorians had no treatment for anaphylaxis. A wasp nest in your attic or under your eaves meant months of carefully avoiding that area, hoping the insects wouldn't decide to invade your living space. The combination of all these creatures created a constant background of irritation and disease risk. You were always itching from some bite or another, always swatting at flies, always checking your food for insect contamination, always hearing the scratch and skitter of rats in the walls. Sleep was difficult not just because of the heat, but because of the certainty that things were crawling on you. Victorians tried various remedies and preventions, most of which didn't work. Sachets of lavender were supposed to repel moths. Pennyroyal was meant to keep fleas away. People would sprinkle diatomaceous earth or lime powder around their homes to kill crawling insects. None of these measures were particularly effective against the sheer scale of the infestation. The wealthy could afford some protections: screened windows, regular fumigations, servants dedicated to pest control. But even the richest homes had flies, had rats, had bedbugs. The pests were universal, democratic in their willingness to infest anyone regardless of social class. The difference was that wealthy people could hire someone else to deal with them. Children grew up accepting these creatures as normal parts of life. Kids would compete to see who could kill the most flies in a minute. They'd set traps for rats and celebrate when they caught one. They'd pick lice out of each other's hair while playing games. The constant presence of pests became so normalised that Victorian children probably couldn't imagine life without them. The psychological impact of sharing your home with thousands of uninvited creatures was significant. You never felt clean, never felt safe, never felt like your space was truly yours. The bugs and rats were always there, always watching, always waiting for you to let your guard down. It created a constant low-level stress that Victorian city dwellers just had to live with. Modern pest control didn't exist. Exterminators weren't a thing. You dealt with pests yourself, or you lived with them. Most people chose the latter because they had no choice. The pests won through sheer numbers and persistence, and all humans could do was adapt, scratch, and try not to think too hard about what was crawling in their walls. Welcome to Victorian summer, where you were never alone and always wished you were. Let's talk about where all that human waste actually went before it made it to the Thames. Spoiler alert, it went into cesspits. which were basically large holes dug beneath or behind houses where everything, and I mean everything, was dumped. These pits were supposed to be emptied regularly by night soil men, but in practice they were often ignored until they overflowed. The cesspit system was Victorian urban planning at its finest, which is to say it was an absolute disaster waiting to happen. And in summer, the waiting was over. The concept was simple enough. Dig a large pit in your yard or beneath your building, line it with bricks if you were fancy, most weren't, and dump all your household waste into it. Chamber pots, kitchen scraps, wash water, everything that couldn't be tossed into the street went into the pit. Then, theoretically, someone would come empty it before it became a problem. That theory worked about as well as you'd expect. Landlords were supposed to pay for regular cesspit emptying, but regular cost money, and why spend money when you could just not? So cesspits would fill up over months or years, the contents slowly breaking down into a thick toxic sludge that would settle at the bottom while the liquid portions soaked into the surrounding soil. In the summer, the heat accelerated decomposition, creating a chemical soup that was part sewage, part compost, and entirely horrifying. The smell from a full cesspit was indescribable, though many Victorians tried. Writers used terms like miasmatic, pestilential, and unbearable, which were polite Victorian ways of saying I literally cannot breathe near this thing without vomiting. In summer heat, the smell would intensify to the point where entire neighbourhoods would reek. You couldn't open your windows without inviting the stench inside. You couldn't sit in your garden without breathing decomposed waste. The smell would permeate your clothes, your hair, your very soul. When cesspits finally got full enough that even the cheapest landlord had to address them, they'd call in the night soil men. These workers had possibly the worst job in human history. They'd arrive after dark, hence the name, to avoid offending the sensibilities of people who wanted their waste removed but didn't want to watch it happen. Armed with buckets, shovels, and a strong stomach, they'd dig into cesspits and manually haul out years' worth of accumulated human waste. The night soil men worked in summer too, which meant they were scooping hot liquid sewage in the middle of the night while trying not to die from the fumes. Cesspits would produce gases, methane, hydrogen sulfide, ammonia, that were both toxic and flammable. Workers would occasionally pass out and fall into the pits, where they'd drown in sewage if their colleagues couldn't pull them out quickly enough. Some cesspits actually exploded when workers brought candles too close to the methane-rich air. Victorian workplace safety at its finest. The removed waste had to go somewhere, which brings us to another layer of the problem. The night soil men would load their carts with barrels of sewage and drive them through the streets to dumping sites outside the city, or to farms where it would be used as fertiliser. In summer, these carts would leak, creating sewage trails through residential neighbourhoods. The smell of a passing night soil cart was so overwhelming that people would slam their windows shut and stuff rags into the cracks, choosing suffocating heat over breathing that particular air. But many cesspits never got emptied at all. They'd just overflow, and that's when things got really interesting. The contents would seep into the surrounding soil, creating wet, stinking patches in yards and basements. The liquid would find cracks in foundations and leach into cellars, where poor families often lived. Imagine your home slowly filling with sewage from the cesspit above, the walls permanently damp with it, the smell never fading. That was reality for thousands of Victorian urbanites. The overflow would also contaminate wells and pumps. Remember, most cesspits weren't properly sealed. They were just holes in the ground, sometimes lined with bricks that had gaps between them, specifically to let liquids drain away. That liquid would seep through the soil and into the water table, which was the same source that fed the local wells and pumps. You'd be drinking water that had been filtered through your neighbour's cesspit, and you'd wonder why everyone on your street kept getting dysentery. In areas with high water tables, the cesspit problem was even worse. The groundwater would rise up into the pits, essentially creating sewage water circulation systems. Fresh water would seep in from below, mix with the waste, then flow back out into the soil, contaminating everything. Some cesspits in flood-prone areas would overflow during heavy rains, sending raw sewage flowing through the streets and into homes. Summer storms were particularly dangerous because they'd mobilise months of accumulated waste all at once. The construction of cesspits was remarkably sloppy. Many were dug too close to buildings, causing foundations to become saturated with sewage and slowly rot. Others were dug too close to neighbouring properties, creating disputes when one person's waste started seeping into another person's cellar or well. There were no regulations about proper cesspit placement or construction until remarkably late in the Victorian era, so people just dug holes wherever was convenient and hoped for the best. Shared cesspits were common in slum buildings, where dozens of families would use the same pit. These would fill up impossibly fast and overflow constantly. The courtyards of slum buildings would often have permanent sewage puddles that residents had to navigate daily. Children would play around these puddles because there was nowhere else to play. The infection rates in these areas were astronomical, but nobody in power seemed particularly concerned as long as the diseases stayed confined to poor neighbourhoods. Some people tried to extend the life of their cesspits by making them larger or digging additional ones. This created situations where properties had multiple cesspits in various states of fullness, turning yards into minefields of underground sewage chambers. Occasionally someone would step on ground that looked solid but was actually just a thin crust over a cesspit, and they'd fall through into liquid waste. It happened often enough that there are multiple documented cases of people drowning in their own cesspit. The location of cesspits relative to food storage created obvious problems. Many houses had their cesspits directly adjacent to their cellars, where food was kept cool. The same porous brick walls that let cesspit liquid drain away also let sewage seep into food storage areas. Vegetables stored in these cellars would absorb the contamination. Preserved foods in jars would be surrounded by sewage-tainted air. The Victorian diet included a surprising amount of literal shit, even if people didn't realise it. Cesspit gases would sometimes find their way into houses through cracks and gaps in floors. Families would notice a terrible smell in their homes and not realise they were slowly being poisoned by sewer gas. Some people would seal up the cracks, which would improve the smell but could lead to dangerous gas build-ups. Others would just live with it, accepting that their home smelled like an outhouse because that's just how things were. The legal situation around cesspits was a mess. Landlords would argue that cesspit maintenance was the tenant's responsibility. Tenants would argue it was the landlord's job. Meanwhile, the cesspit would overflow, contaminate the neighbourhood, and sicken dozens of people. Local authorities had minimal power to enforce emptying, and the fines for non-compliance were so small that wealthy landlords would just pay them, rather than deal with the expense of proper maintenance. Some cesspits were connected to rudimentary drains that were supposed to carry overflow to the nearest sewer or river. These drains were often just open channels running through multiple properties, creating shared sewage streams that would stagnate in summer heat. The drains would clog with solid waste, back up, and flood cellars with sewage. Clearing these drains was nobody's responsibility and everybody's problem, so they'd often stay clogged for months. The industries that dealt with cesspit waste created their own problems. Bone boilers, tallow makers, and gut scrapers would set up shop near residential areas, processing the solid waste from cesspits into products like soap and fertiliser. These operations produced smells that made the cesspits themselves seem pleasant by comparison. In summer, the smell from these industries combined with the cesspit odours to create a comprehensive stench coverage that blanketed entire neighbourhoods. Public cesspits serving multiple buildings were catastrophic. These massive pits would serve hundreds of people and would be emptied far less frequently than private ones because the cost had to be shared or covered by local authorities with no budget. They'd become open sewage lakes, bubbling and steaming in the summer sun, producing gas clouds that would drift across neighbourhoods. People living near public cesspits suffered higher disease rates and lower property values, creating poverty-disease cycles that were impossible to escape. The failure of the cesspit system was obvious to anyone with functioning senses, but replacing it required massive infrastructure investment that authorities were reluctant to make. Edwin Chadwick and other reformers documented the problems extensively in the 1840s, showing the direct connection between cesspits, contaminated water and disease. Their reports were read, acknowledged, and then mostly ignored because fixing the problem would cost money and upset landlords who profited from the current system. It wasn't until the Great Stink of 1858 forced Parliament's hand that proper sewers began to be built. Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system was revolutionary, because it actually carried waste away, instead of just storing it underground until it contaminated everything. But building the sewers took years, and during that time, Victorians continued to live above, beside, and sometimes in their cesspits, breathing the fumes, drinking the contaminated water, and dying from the diseases. Even after sewers were built, many properties kept their cesspits because connecting to the new sewer system cost money. Some houses had both, a cesspit for solid waste and a sewer connection for water drainage, creating complicated systems that often didn't work properly. The cesspit problem persisted well into the late Victorian era, and even into the early 20th century in some areas. The psychological impact of living with cesspits was significant. You were always aware, especially in summer, that you were living on top of or next to a pit full of decomposing human waste. The smell was a constant reminder. The flies breeding in the pit were ambassadors of its contents. The sick neighbours were evidence of its danger. You couldn't ignore it, couldn't escape it, could only accept it as another miserable aspect of Victorian urban life. In summer, the cesspit problem wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. The combination of heat, decomposition, contaminated water, and disease vectors created perfect conditions for cholera, typhoid, and dysentery outbreaks. The cesspits that were supposed to solve the waste problem had become the source of epidemics. The Victorians eventually figured it out, but not before decades of people living in their own waste and paying the price with their health and lives. Summer in Victorian cities didn't just smell bad, it killed people. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and a whole alphabet soup of other diseases thrived in the heat. Cholera was the big one, the disease that made Victorians collectively lose their minds every summer. It spread through contaminated water, which, as we've established, was basically all the water. Cholera didn't just kill you, it killed you in the most horrifying way imaginable, and it did it fast. You'd wake up feeling fine, drink some water from the local pump, and by evening you'd be experiencing violent diarrhea and vomiting that would drain your body of fluids so quickly your skin would turn blue-grey. Your eyes would sink back into your skull, your fingers would wrinkle like you'd been in the bath for hours. This was called washerwoman's hands, which is a disturbingly poetic term for a sign that you were rapidly dying. The speed of cholera was terrifying. A healthy adult could be dead within 24 hours of showing the first symptoms. Children and the elderly went even faster. You'd see someone walking to work in the morning, hear they'd taken ill by noon, and attend their funeral the next day. Entire families would be wiped out in a week. Streets that had been full of life would fall silent as household after household succumbed. The fluid loss was extraordinary. A cholera patient could lose several gallons of fluid per day through uncontrollable diarrhea. The Victorian term for this was rice water stool, because it looked like the water rice had been cooked in, pale, cloudy, and flecked with mucus. This delightful detail was noted by every doctor who described the disease, as if calling it rice water made it any less horrifying. The smell was indescribable, sweet and rotten at the same time, and it would fill entire houses and hospital wards. Doctors had no idea how to treat cholera because they didn't understand what caused it. The miasma theory said it was bad air, so they'd try to improve ventilation, which did nothing. Some doctors bled patients, which definitely helped by removing more fluids from already dehydrated bodies. Others prescribed opium, which at least made patients more comfortable while they died. A few doctors stumbled onto rehydration as a treatment, giving patients water with salt and sugar, but this was considered radical and wasn't widely adopted until decades later. The 1854 cholera outbreak in London's Soho district was particularly devastating. It killed over 600 people in just 10 days. Dr. John Snow traced the outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street and removed the pump handle which stopped the outbreak. This should have been the moment everyone realised cholera came from water, but no. Many doctors and officials dismissed Snow's findings because they contradicted the miasma theory. They'd rather stick with their incorrect theory than accept evidence that didn't fit their worldview. Victorian scientific method at its finest. Typhoid fever was cholera's slower, equally deadly cousin. Instead of killing you in a day, typhoid took its time, making you suffer for weeks. The fever would climb steadily, reaching temperatures of 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. In summer, when ambient temperatures were already high, typhoid patients would literally cook from the inside out. Their brains would fry, causing delirium and hallucinations. They'd thrash around in their beds soaked in sweat, sometimes falling into comas before dying. The Victorian name for typhoid was enteric fever, which sounds almost dignified until you learn what it does to your intestines. The bacteria would create ulcers in your gut that could perforate, spilling intestinal contents into your abdominal cavity and causing peritonitis. This was an excruciating way to die, and there was nothing doctors could do except provide opium and hope. Some patients would develop internal bleeding, vomiting blood or passing black, tarry stools until they bled out internally. Prince Albert died of typhoid in 1861, which finally made the upper classes take the disease seriously. Apparently it was fine when poor people died by the thousands, but when the royal consort kicked the bucket, suddenly everyone was interested in public health reform. Queen Victoria went into mourning for the rest of her life. 40 years, which is impressively dramatic, but maybe those 40 years could have been spent fixing the water supply that killed her husband. Dysentery came in multiple varieties, all of them unpleasant. Bacillary dysentery caused bloody diarrhea, severe cramping and fever. Amoebic dysentery added liver abscesses to the mix, just to keep things interesting. Both thrived in summer conditions, spreading through contaminated food and water. The bloody stools were distinctive enough that dysentery was hard to mistake for other diseases, which was small comfort when you were experiencing it. Children were particularly vulnerable to dysentery because they couldn't fight the dehydration as effectively as adults. Infant mortality rates from summer diarrhea, which was usually dysentery, were astronomical. In the worst slum neighbourhoods, 1 in 3 children wouldn't survive their first year, largely due to dysentery and similar intestinal diseases. Parents would have multiple children expecting that several wouldn't make it to adulthood, which is perhaps the most depressing family planning strategy imaginable. Scarlet fever made regular summer appearances, particularly in crowded neighbourhoods. This bacterial infection caused a distinctive red rash that gave the disease its name. The rash would start on your chest and neck, then spread across your body, making you look like you'd been badly sunburned. Your tongue would swell and develop a strawberry-like appearance, which sounds cute but was actually quite uncomfortable. In severe cases, the bacteria would release toxins that could damage your heart, kidneys and joints. Before antibiotics, scarlet fever killed about 15 to 20% of infected children. The rest would survive but might develop complications like rheumatic fever, which would damage their heart valves and lead to heart disease later in life. Many Victorian adults with weak hearts were actually dealing with childhood scarlet fever damage that had never healed properly. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, wasn't specifically a summer disease, but the heat made it worse. TB patients would cough constantly, producing bloody sputum that would spray bacteria into the air for others to breathe. They'd waste away slowly, losing weight and energy until they were barely recognisable. In summer heat, TB patients would suffer even more from the fever and night sweats that characterise the disease, soaking through their bedding and clothes while steadily declining. The treatment for tuberculosis was rest, fresh air and good nutrition. 3 things the working poor had no access to, so TB would spread through crowded slum buildings, passed from person to person through coughing and close contact. Entire families would contract it. Some would survive, many wouldn't. The disease was so common that having a consumptive relative was just a normal part of life. Diphtheria was a childhood killer that peaked in late summer and early autumn. The bacterial infection would create a thick membrane in the throat that could block breathing. Children would literally suffocate, their faces turning blue as they struggled for air. Parents could only watch helplessly as their children choked to death. Some doctors tried to cut into the trachea to allow breathing, but without proper surgical techniques or antibiotics to fight the infection, most of these attempts failed. Smallpox continued to terrorise Victorian cities despite vaccination being available. The problem was that vaccination wasn't mandatory until 1853, and even then enforcement was patchy. Many people distrusted vaccines. Some things never change, and refused to vaccinate their children. Summer smallpox outbreaks would sweep through unvaccinated populations, leaving survivors permanently scarred and sometimes blind. The pustules that covered smallpox victims' bodies would erupt and ooze, and in summer heat the smell of infected pustules in crowded hospital wards was overwhelming. Measles was another summer visitor that particularly targeted children. While most Victorian kids would survive measles, the complications could be deadly. Pneumonia, encephalitis, and ear infections could follow the initial infection. In crowded, poorly ventilated homes in summer heat, measles would spread rapidly through all the children in a household. Schools would close during outbreaks, which sounds like a holiday until you realise it was because too many students were dying to continue classes. Whooping cough would circulate through neighbourhoods in waves, affecting primarily young children. The characteristic whoop sound, a desperate gasping breath after a fit of coughing, would echo through houses and streets. Babies with whooping cough would turn blue during coughing fits, and many would die from exhaustion or secondary infections. The coughing fits could last for months, earning the disease the name the 100-day cough. Then there were the foodborne illnesses that exploded in summer. Food poisoning from spoiled meat, fish, or dairy products would cause violent vomiting and diarrhea. Botulism from improperly preserved foods would cause paralysis and death. Various mysterious ailments that we'd now recognise as bacterial or parasitic infections would sweep through communities, defying Victorian attempts at understanding or treatment. The psychological impact of living through summer disease season was immense. You never knew if you or your family would be next. Every headache could be the start of typhoid. Every stomachache might be cholera. Every cough could be TB or whooping cough or diphtheria. Parents lived in constant fear for their children. People avoided sick neighbours, which was sensible but meant that the ill often suffered alone and died without comfort. Hospitals and workhouse infirmaries would overflow with summer disease victims. These institutions were understaffed, under-resourced, and often just places where sick people went to die surrounded by other sick people. The cross-contamination in these places was tremendous. You might enter with dysentery and leave with typhoid, if you left at all. Many Victorians preferred to die at home rather than face the horror of Victorian hospital care. The mortality statistics from summer diseases are staggering. In a bad cholera year, thousands would die in London alone. Add in typhoid, dysentery, and all the other summer killers, and you're looking at tens of thousands of excess deaths every summer. The poor died at much higher rates than the wealthy, but disease didn't care much about class boundaries. It would creep from the slums into middle-class neighbourhoods, occasionally reaching even the wealthy areas. Nobody was truly safe. The medical profession was largely helpless. Doctors would try their best, but without germ theory, antibiotics, or proper understanding of disease transmission, they were essentially guessing. They'd prescribe medicines that didn't work, perform treatments that made things worse, and watch their patients die while feeling frustrated and inadequate. Some doctors began to suspect that water contamination was the problem, but they were voices in the wilderness, drowned out by the established medical consensus that disease came from bad air. The cycle would repeat every summer. Warm weather would arrive, water would get contaminated, diseases would spread, people would die, and authorities would promise to do better next year. Then next year would come, and the same thing would happen again. It took decades of this preventable carnage before meaningful reforms were implemented. Summer in Victorian cities was a death lottery, and everyone bought a ticket whether they wanted to or not. The summer of 1858 was special, and not in a good way. That was the year the Thames became so unbearably foul that even the rich and powerful couldn't ignore it anymore. The smell was so overpowering that members of Parliament, whose offices overlooked the river, couldn't function. They hung curtains soaked in chloride of the lime over the windows, but it didn't help. The summer of 1858 was exceptionally hot and dry. Week after week of blazing sun and minimal rainfall meant the Thames dropped to its lowest levels in years. This concentrated the sewage even further, creating a toxic sludge that cooked in the summer heat, like some kind of apocalyptic stew. The smell that rose from the river wasn't just unpleasant. It was a physical presence, a thick, choking miasma that settled over the entire city like a blanket made of decomposed nightmares. London had experienced bad summers before, but this one achieved a level of horrific distinction that earned it a permanent place in history books. The smell was so powerful that it could be detected miles from the river. People in neighbourhoods that had never even seen the Thames were suddenly intimately familiar with its aromatic properties. The entire city reeked, and there was nowhere to escape. Opening your windows meant inviting the stench inside. Closing them meant suffocating in the summer heat. It was a choice between breathing putrid air or not breathing at all. The wealthy, who usually insulated themselves from the worst urban problems, found themselves just as affected as everyone else. Their expensive houses still had windows. Their private parks still had air. Money couldn't buy you a nose that didn't work, and for once, the upper classes were experiencing what the poor had endured for decades. The difference was that when rich people suffered, things actually changed. Parliament, housed in the Palace of Westminster right on the Thames embankment, bore the full brunt of the Great Stink. Members of Parliament would arrive for sessions and immediately begin gagging. Some vomited, others fainted, many simply fled the building, unable to tolerate the conditions. This was the government of the British Empire, the most powerful nation on earth, reduced to a gaggle of retching gentlemen trying not to pass out from the smell of their own waste. The attempts to make Parliament functional during the Great Stink were both creative and completely inadequate. The curtains soaked in chloride of lime, essentially bleach, were hung over every window facing the river. This created its own problems, as chloride of lime has a harsh chemical smell that burned people's eyes and throats. So now MPs were choosing between the smell of sewage and the smell of chemicals that might be actively damaging their lungs. Some members brought handkerchiefs soaked in perfume, creating a bizarre scene of gentlemen conducting the nation's business, while holding scented cloths to their faces like they were attending a particularly foul plague ward. The Library Committee considered relocating Parliament entirely. They proposed moving to Hampton Court or some other location far from the Thames, which tells you exactly how bad things were. The government of Britain was ready to abandon its historic seat of power because the smell was too much to handle. In the end, they didn't move, but the fact that it was seriously discussed shows just how desperate the situation had become. The press had a field day. Newspapers ran daily updates on the smell, complete with increasingly creative descriptions. The Times called it a stink which overpowers all others. Punch magazine published cartoons showing politicians fleeing Parliament while holding their noses, or Father Thames as a diseased, death-dealing figure. The coverage was relentless, keeping the issue in public consciousness day after day. For once, the media's obsession with a story actually led to positive change. Benjamin Disraeli, then a prominent MP and future Prime Minister, complained that he couldn't use his library because the smell from the river made it impossible to concentrate. When Disraeli, one of the most influential politicians of the era, publicly admitted defeat to a smell, you knew things were serious. Other MPs echoed his complaints, describing how the stench penetrated every room, how it clung to their clothes and hair, how they'd go home reeking of sewage despite never having been near the river. The problem was that for decades, authorities had been dumping raw sewage directly into the Thames, believing the river would somehow magically purify itself. They'd built over 200,000 cess pits throughout London, and when those overflowed, the waste drained into the river. They'd constructed rudimentary sewers that emptied straight into the Thames. Every flush, every emptied chamber pot, every washing of clothes or dishes that involved wastewater, all of it ended up in the river. And then they pumped that same water back out to use as drinking water. The logic was truly spectacular. Edwin Chadwick and other reformers had been warning about this for years. They'd published reports showing the connection between contaminated water and disease. They'd mapped cholera outbreaks and traced them to specific water sources. They'd pleaded with Parliament to fund proper sewage infrastructure, and Parliament had nodded sympathetically and then done absolutely nothing, because fixing the problem would cost money, upset property owners, and interfere with the cherished Victorian belief that the free market would solve everything. But the Great Stink changed the equation. Suddenly it wasn't just poor people dying of cholera in slums, it was MPs being unable to work. It was wealthy merchants closing their riverside offices. It was tourists avoiding London because the smell was internationally famous. The economic and political costs of inaction had finally exceeded the costs of fixing the problem. Sometimes, unfortunately, people only care about issues when they personally suffer from them. Parliament moved with unprecedented speed. In just 18 days they passed legislation authorising the construction of a comprehensive sewer system for London. 18 days. For context, they'd been debating sewage reform for over a decade with no results. But give them a summer where they had to smell their own waste while trying to govern, and suddenly bureaucracy could move at lightning speed. The power of personal discomfort is truly remarkable. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to design and oversee the construction of the new sewer system. His design was brilliant. A network of underground sewers that would intercept waste before it reached the Thames and carry it downstream to treatment facilities east of the city. The system would use gravity wherever possible, with pumping stations only where necessary. It would be built large enough to handle London's growing population for decades to come. Bazalgette even built in extra capacity beyond what calculations suggested was needed, because he wisely assumed the city would continue to grow. The construction project was massive. Bazalgette's sewers required over 1,100 miles of street sewers, feeding into 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. They had to dig up streets throughout the city, displacing traffic and business. They had to construct pumping stations, treatment facilities, and embankments. The project employed thousands of workers and took years to complete. It was one of the great engineering achievements of the Victorian era, and it literally saved London from drowning in its own waste. But the Great Stink wasn't just about sewers. It represented a fundamental shift in how authorities thought about public health and urban planning. Before 1858, sanitation was seen as a private matter. Each property owner was responsible for their own waste, and if people got sick, well, that was just bad luck or God's will or moral failing. After the Great Stink, there was growing acceptance that public health required public solutions, that cities needed infrastructure, that government had a role in protecting citizens from disease. The impact went beyond London. Other British cities took notice and began planning their own sewer systems. The Great Stink became a cautionary tale told around the world. Ignore your sewage problems long enough and eventually you'll be forced to address them, probably at greater cost and after more suffering than if you'd dealt with it earlier. It was an expensive lesson, paid for with decades of disease and death, but at least it was finally learned. The irony of the Great Stink is that it wasn't particularly deadly compared to other summers. Cholera outbreaks in previous years had killed far more people, but those people were mostly poor, living in slums, easy to ignore. The Great Stink didn't kill many people, it just inconvenienced wealthy ones. And that apparently was what it took to spark real change. The poor had been dying of waterborne diseases for decades, but Parliament only acted when MPs couldn't hold meetings without gagging. The summer of 1858 was also a turning point for the miasma theory. People had believed that disease came from bad air, from miasmas rising from sewage and garbage. The Great Stink seemed to confirm this. The smell was terrible. People felt sick from it. Clearly the bad air was causing disease. But the odd thing was, despite the overwhelming stench, there wasn't a major disease outbreak that summer. The smell was apocalyptic, but the death rate was relatively normal. This started some doctors questioning the miasma theory. Maybe disease didn't come from bad smells after all. Maybe there was something else going on. John Snow had already demonstrated the connection between contaminated water and cholera in 1854, but his work had been largely dismissed. The Great Stink, paradoxically, helped his case. If bad air caused disease, then the summer of 1858 should have been catastrophically deadly. Since it wasn't, maybe bad air wasn't the culprit. The pieces were slowly coming together toward germ theory, though it would take another decade or two for the medical establishment to fully accept it. The construction of Bazalgette's sewers took nearly 20 years to complete fully. During that time, Londoners continued to suffer through summers of heat, smell, and disease. But the difference was that now there was hope. They could see the construction happening. They could watch the new embankments rising along the Thames. They knew that eventually things would improve, and they did. The new sewers dramatically reduced cholera and typhoid deaths. The Thames slowly began to recover. Fish returned to the river. The city became more livable. The Great Stink of 1858 showed that even the most entrenched problems can be solved when the political will exists. It demonstrated that engineering and public investment can dramatically improve public health. It proved that cities need infrastructure, not just markets and private initiative. These lessons seem obvious now, but in 1858 they were revolutionary. The Victorians had to learn them the hard way, through decades of disease and death, culminating in a summer so foul that even Parliament couldn't ignore it anymore. So the next time you flush a toilet and your waste disappears into a vast underground sewer system that carries it away for treatment, thank the great stink. Thank the MPs who couldn't stand the smell of their own sewage. Thank Joseph Basil Gett for building a system that still works over 150 years later. And thank the fact that you live in an era where we don't wait for catastrophe to force our hand before addressing obvious problems. Well, most of the time anyway. Got sick during Victorian summer? Well, you could always see a doctor. Emphasis on could, because their treatments were often worse than the disease. Doctors still believed in the miasma theory, the idea that diseases were caused by bad air, not germs. So their solution to cholera, typhoid and dysentery was usually get some fresh air and maybe try bleeding yourself. Let's start with bloodletting, because nothing says advanced medical care quite like deliberately making sick people lose blood. The theory, inherited from ancient medicine and somehow still kicking around in the 1850s, was that illness resulted from an imbalance of bodily humours. Too much blood. Obviously that's making you sick. The cure was to remove some of that excess blood through either opening a vein with a lancet or applying leeches to suck it out. The fact that patients weakened by cholera or typhoid were already severely dehydrated and desperately needed fluids, not fluid removal, didn't seem to factor into medical thinking. Doctors would confidently bleed patients suffering from fevers, reasoning that the blood was too hot and needed to be released. They'd open veins and drain pints of blood from people who were already dying, essentially speeding up the process while charging the family for the privilege. Some patients did feel temporarily better after bloodletting, probably because they'd fainted from blood loss and therefore weren't conscious to feel their other symptoms. Victorian medicine interpreted this as success. Leeches were considered a more refined approach to bloodletting. Medical suppliers kept live leeches in jars, and doctors would apply them to various body parts depending on what they thought needed treating. Headache, leeches to the temples, fever, leeches to the neck, mystery illness, leeches everywhere. The leeches would attach, feed until they were engorged, then fall off, leaving bleeding wounds that would continue oozing for hours. In summer heat, these wounds would become infected, adding a new disease to the one the leeches were supposed to treat. Purging was another favourite Victorian medical intervention. Doctors believed that disease could be expelled from the body through aggressive bowel movements. So they'd prescribe powerful laxatives to patients who often already had diarrhoea. Cholera patient with violent diarrhoea? Here, have some calomel, mercury chloride, to make you purge even more. The logic was that you needed to expel the disease matter from your system. The reality was that you'd die of dehydration even faster, but at least you'd die with empty bowels. Calomel deserves special mention, because Victorians used it for everything. This mercury compound was prescribed for constipation, fever, syphilis, depression, toothache, basically any ailment you can name. It would make you salivate excessively, your gums would swell and bleed, your teeth would fall out, and eventually you'd develop mercury poisoning. But hey, at least it relieved your constipation before it killed you. The fact that mercury is a toxic heavy metal that causes permanent neurological damage wasn't yet understood, so doctors handed it out like candy. Opium and its derivative laudanum were the Victorian answer to pain relief, anxiety, insomnia, coughs, and pretty much everything else. Unlike bloodletting and mercury, opium actually did something useful. It relieved pain and helped people relax. The problem was that it was wildly addictive, and doctors prescribed it for conditions that didn't warrant such strong medication. Children's teething, laudanum, can't sleep, laudanum, menstrual cramps, laudanum. Victorian Britain was swimming in opiates, and addiction was rampant, though they called it dependence, and thought it was a moral failing rather than a medical condition. The treatments for specific summer diseases were particularly creative. For cholera, some doctors recommended drinking diluted sulfuric acid, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Others prescribed arsenic, another poison, on the theory that it would somehow counteract the cholera poison. Some advocated for hot mustard baths, reasoning that if you made the patient extremely uncomfortable externally, it would distract from the internal discomfort. None of these worked, but they did create additional suffering, which Victorian medicine seemed to view as therapeutic in itself. Typhoid treatments included cold baths to bring down fever, which sounds reasonable until you learn that they'd submerged delirious patients in ice water for extended periods, sometimes causing shock or pneumonia. Other doctors recommended warm baths instead, creating a medical controversy over whether fever patients should be frozen or gently heated. Both sides were wrong because neither approach addressed the bacterial infection causing the fever, but at least they felt confident in their wrongness. Blistering was a popular treatment that involved deliberately burning or chemically irritating the skin to create blisters. The theory was that this would draw out the disease from inside the body. Doctors would apply hot plasters or chemicals like cantharids, made from crushed beetles, to patients' skin, creating painful blisters that would weep and potentially become infected. For chest complaints, they'd blister the chest. For headaches, the forehead. It was systematic torture disguised as medicine, and patients paid for it. Cupping was another method of supposedly drawing out disease. Heated glass cups would be placed on the skin, creating suction as they cooled. This would pull the skin up into the cup and create circular bruises. Sometimes the skin would be cut first, combining cupping with bloodletting for a 2-for-1 special. The resulting marks looked like you'd been attacked by a very organised octopus, and they achieved absolutely nothing except temporary pain and bruising. Dietary recommendations for sick patients were spectacularly bad. Fever patients were often denied water because doctors believed it would feed the fever. This was particularly catastrophic for cholera and typhoid patients who desperately needed hydration. Instead, they were given wine, brandy, or even champagne, on the theory that alcohol was more nourishing than water. Some patients were kept on starvation diets because doctors believed the body needed to focus its energy on fighting disease rather than digesting food. The result was patients who were simultaneously dying from their illness and starving to death. Victorian doctors also loved their toxic metals. In addition to mercury, they prescribed antimony, which causes vomiting, arsenic, which, is poison, and lead compounds for various ailments. Lead acetate was called sugar of lead because it had a sweet taste, and was used for all sorts of conditions despite causing lead poisoning, brain damage, and death. Some of these metal-based medicines are why Victorian-era graves have such high concentrations of toxic elements. The patients were basically pickled in poison before they died. Patent medicines were hugely popular and completely unregulated. Anyone could mix up a batch of questionable ingredients, claim it cured everything from baldness to consumption, and sell it to desperate people. These concoctions often contained alcohol, opiates, cocaine, or mercury in various combinations. Some were harmless but useless. Others were actively dangerous. All of them were marketed with outrageous claims and testimonials from cured patients who probably didn't exist. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children was particularly egregious. It contained morphine and was marketed to mothers as a way to calm fussy babies. It did calm them by getting them addicted to opiates. Some babies died from overdoses, but the product remained popular because desperate parents would try anything to quiet a crying child in a hot, crowded home. The syrup wasn't banned until the early 20th century, after decades of infant deaths. Godfrey's cordial was another opium-based child remedy that working mothers used extensively. They'd give it to their children before leaving for work, essentially drugging them into unconsciousness for the day. Some children never woke up. Others developed addictions or suffered developmental problems. But it was cheap, legal, and widely available, so parents continued using it despite the risks. The treatment of women's health issues was particularly horrific. Any female complaint, depression, anxiety, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, tiredness, excessive energy, literally anything, could be diagnosed as hysteria, which doctors believed was caused by a wandering uterus. Treatments included bed rest, isolation from family and friends, forced feeding, vaginal or rectal douches, and sometimes removal of the clitoris or ovaries. These treatments were based on the medical establishment's firm belief that women were inherently unstable and their reproductive organs made them crazy. Rest cures for wealthy women with nervous conditions meant being confined to bed for weeks or months, forbidden from reading, writing, or doing anything mentally stimulating. They'd be fed bland food and treated like invalids until they either recovered from sheer boredom or had actual breakdowns from the enforced isolation. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's famous story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was based on her experience with this treatment, which drove her to the brink of madness. Surgical procedures in summer were particularly dangerous because of the heat and flies. Operations were performed without proper sterilisation. Doctors didn't wash their hands or instruments because they didn't understand germ theory. They'd operate in the same blood-stained coats they'd worn all week, moving from patient to patient and spreading infection. In summer, surgical wounds would become infected almost immediately, and with no antibiotics, infection meant likely death. The mortality rate for surgery was astronomical, yet doctors continued cutting people open with unwashed hands and dirty tools. Anaesthesia had been introduced by the Victorian era, which was a genuine improvement over earlier times. However, dosing was imprecise, and sometimes patients would wake up mid-surgery, or they'd be given too much and never wake up at all. Ether and chloroform were the main options, both of which were dangerous and could cause death if administered incorrectly. Some religious folks argued against anaesthesia, claiming that pain during surgery or childbirth was God's will and shouldn't be avoided. These people were, thankfully, increasingly ignored. The sad reality was that for most of the Victorian era, your best chance of surviving illness was to avoid doctors entirely and hope your body healed itself. The medical establishment was practicing pre-scientific medicine, guided by theories that had been wrong for thousands of years but were defended with absolute confidence. Doctors were well-intentioned mostly, but their treatments were based on fundamental misunderstandings of how the human body worked. Some doctors did begin questioning traditional approaches. The sanitarians, led by people like Edwin Chadwick, argued that clean water and proper sewage disposal prevented disease. This was closer to correct, though they still believed the mechanism was miasma rather than germs. A few doctors experimented with actually helpful treatments like rehydration for cholera patients, but they were dismissed by the mainstream medical establishment as radicals. It wasn't until the 1860s and 1870s that germ theory began to gain acceptance, and even then, many doctors resisted. The idea that tiny invisible organisms cause disease seemed absurd to physicians who'd built entire careers on bleeding and purging. Accepting germ theory meant admitting they'd been wrong about everything, that they'd potentially killed patients with their treatments, that decades of medical education was based on nonsense. That's a hard pill to swallow, even harder than the ones they'd been prescribing. So if you got sick in Victorian summer, your options were suffer through it and hope you survived, or see a doctor who might bleed you, purge you, poison you with mercury, or burn blisters onto your skin, all while charging you money and confidently explaining that this was absolutely the right treatment based on centuries of medical knowledge. Sometimes the old ways are old because they're terrible, not because they're wise. Victorian fashion was already ridiculous, but in summer it became actively dangerous. Women's corsets, pulled tight even in sweltering heat, restricted breathing and compressed internal organs. Fainting was so common it was practically a fashion accessory. Women carried smelling salts the way we carry phones today, just in case they suddenly collapsed from lack of oxygen. The Victorian ideal of feminine beauty required a waist so small it looked physically impossible, because it was. The fashionable waist measurement was around 18 to 20 inches, which for most adult women meant cinching their natural waist down by 6 to 10 inches, using nothing but whalebone, steel, and sheer determination. This wasn't achieved through exercise or diet. This was pure mechanical compression. Your organs had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was anywhere but where they naturally belonged. The corset would push your liver up, your stomach sideways, and your intestines down and back, creating a cramped internal traffic jam of displaced organs. Breathing became shallow because your lungs couldn't fully expand. Digestion suffered because your stomach was literally being squeezed. Blood circulation was restricted, which is why women's hands and feet would go cold even in summer heat. But at least your waist looked tiny, which was apparently worth risking permanent organ damage. The tight-lacing process was an ordeal. You'd put on your corset and have someone else, a maid if you were wealthy, a family member if you weren't, pull the laces as tight as humanly possible while you held onto furniture and tried not to pass out. Each pull would squeeze you tighter, each breath becoming more difficult, until finally the laces were tied off and you were encased in your fashionable prison for the next 12 to 16 hours. Taking a deep breath was impossible. Bending at the waist was forbidden by physics. Eating a full meal was inadvisable unless you wanted your compressed stomach to rebel spectacularly. In summer, wearing a corset meant creating a personal sauna around your torso. The heavy fabric, often multiple layers of cotton or coutil, would trap heat and moisture against your skin. You'd sweat profusely, but the moisture had nowhere to evaporate, so it would just soak into the corset fabric and your chemise underneath. By midday, you'd be marinating in your own perspiration, the corset growing heavier and more uncomfortable with each hour. The chafing was inevitable. Rough fabric soaked in sweat rubbing against compressed skin for hours. Women would develop raw, bleeding patches under their corsets that would become infected if not treated properly. Fainting wasn't a sign of delicate feminine constitution. It was a predictable result of restricting oxygen intake while overheating. When you can't breathe properly, and your body is trying to cool itself but can't because you're wrapped in 17 layers of fabric, eventually your brain says enough and shuts down briefly. Victorian ladies would feel the warning signs, dizziness, spots in their vision, nausea, and would delicately excuse themselves or simply crumple where they stood. This happened so often that fainting couches became standard furniture in homes, and smelling salts were carried by every woman who could afford them. Smelling salts were ammonia-based compounds that would jolt you back to consciousness through sheer chemical assault on your nostrils. They worked by irritating your nasal passages and lungs, forcing you to breathe more deeply and quickly, which would restore oxygen to your brain. The fact that an entire industry existed to sell products that woke you up from fashion-induced unconsciousness should tell you everything about Victorian priorities. Looking proper was more important than remaining conscious. The health effects of long-term corset wearing were catastrophic. Women who wore tightly laced corsets from their teenage years often developed permanently deformed rib cages. Their floating ribs would bend and sometimes fracture, healing in unnatural positions. Their spines would curve abnormally. Their internal organs would be permanently displaced. Some women's livers developed deep grooves from years of pressure from corset boning. X-rays from this era show rib cages that look like they've been in industrial accidents, and the only accident was fashion. Pregnancy in a corset was its own special horror. Wealthy women might loosen their corsets or switch to more flexible maternity stays, but many women, desperate to hide their pregnancies as long as possible or simply unable to afford maternity clothing, would keep wearing their regular corsets. This compressed the developing fetus, restricted blood flow, and sometimes caused miscarriages. The Victorian infant mortality rate was bad enough without adding crushed by mother's fashionable garment to the list of causes, but here we are. Men's fashion was less immediately dangerous but still profoundly uncomfortable in summer. The Victorian gentleman's outfit included a linen shirt, an undershirt, a stiff collar that could double as a torture device, a cravat or tie, a vest or waistcoat, and a heavy wool jacket, all of this in summer. The collar deserves special attention because it was designed by someone who clearly hated necks. Made of heavily starched linen or paper, these collars were separate pieces that attached to the shirt with studs. They were rigid, uncomfortable, and cut into your neck with every movement. In summer heat, the starch would begin to wilt, and the collar would transform from rigidly uncomfortable to damply uncomfortable, rubbing raw patches on your neck that would sting with every drop of sweat. The wool jackets men wore were typically dark colours, black, dark grey, dark brown, because lighter colours showed dirt too easily. Dark wool in summer sun is basically a portable oven. The fabric would absorb heat, trap it against your body, and slowly cook you like a roast. Men would sweat through their shirts and undershirts, creating visible wet patches that were considered deeply embarrassing. So you tried to keep your jacket on to hide the sweat stains, which would make you sweat more, creating a vicious cycle of increasing dampness and social anxiety. Top hats were mandatory for respectable gentlemen, and these towering cylinders of felted beaver fur were spectacularly unsuited to hot weather. They'd sit on your head like a small furry chimney, trapping heat and ensuring your scalp sweated profusely. The internal hatband would become soaked with sweat, staining the felt and creating a permanent ring of discoloration that marked you as someone whose head perspired. Removing your hat indoors was required etiquette, but outdoors you'd have to keep it on regardless of temperature, slowly baking your brain while maintaining appearances. Children's fashion was adult fashion but smaller, which meant children suffered all the same discomforts in miniature. Little girls wore corsets from around age 10 or 12, training their bodies into fashionable shapes while their bones were still developing. Boys wore the same heavy wool suits as their fathers, complete with stiff collars and restrictive clothing. There was no such thing as play clothes for middle and upper-class children. They were expected to look respectable at all times, which meant being constantly uncomfortable. The fabrics themselves were part of the problem. Natural fibres like wool, cotton and linen were the only options, and while cotton and linen were reasonably breathable, wool certainly wasn't. But wool was considered more proper, more substantial, more respectable. Cotton was for undergarments and summer dresses, if you were wealthy enough to have summer-specific clothing. Most people wore the same wool garments year-round, just suffering more in summer. The concept of seasonal wardrobes was a luxury few could afford. Dyes used in Victorian clothing were often toxic. Brilliant green dresses were coloured with arsenic compounds. Certain red and pink dyes contained mercury. These toxic dyes would leach out when you perspired, being absorbed through your skin all day long. Women's skin would develop rashes and sores where the dyed fabric touched. Some people died from long-term exposure to arsenic in their clothing, slowly poisoned by their own wardrobes. But the colours were so fashionable and fashion demanded sacrifice. Gloves were mandatory for anyone claiming respectability. Ladies wore gloves outdoors at all times, kid leather, cotton or silk, depending on the occasion. These would become sweaty, disgusting and sometimes rancid in summer heat. Your hands would be trapped in damp leather or cotton, unable to cool themselves, developing their own miniature ecosystem of bacteria and funk. Gentlemen also wore gloves for formal occasions, experiencing the same clammy hand prison situation. Removing your gloves inappropriately was a social faux pas, so you'd keep them on, slowly drowning your hands in their own perspiration. Women's shoes were another torture device disguised as fashion. Narrow, pointed, often with small heels, these shoes weren't designed for walking so much as for looking delicate while being carried places. The leather would be thin and decorative rather than supportive or comfortable. In summer heat, your feet would swell, but the shoes wouldn't expand, creating a crushing sensation that made every step painful. Blisters were guaranteed. Bunions and deformed toes were common, but small, dainty feet were fashionable, so women would squeeze into shoes that were sometimes deliberately too small to achieve the desired aesthetic. The layering of clothing meant that no air could circulate around your body. Women wore chemises, drawers, corsets, corset covers, multiple petticoats, and finally their dress, creating a fabric cocoon that trapped heat and moisture. Men had their undershirts, shirts, vests, and jackets, performing similar thermal imprisonment. Your skin would become perpetually damp in summer, never dry, never cool, just constantly moist and uncomfortable. This created perfect conditions for fungal infections, rashes, and skin breakdown. Victorian dermatology must have been fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. Hats for women were elaborate architectural achievements that defied both gravity and common sense. Wide-brimmed, loaded with decorations, flowers, ribbons, feathers, sometimes entire taxidermied birds, these hats were heavy, unbalanced, and secured to your head with long pins that you'd stab through your hair and the hat. In summer, the weight of the hat combined with the restricted breathing from your corset could trigger headaches and dizziness. The pins would shift as you moved, occasionally stabbing your scalp, and if it was windy, you'd have to hold onto your elaborate hat while trying to walk in a restrictive dress and painful shoes, a feat that required genuine coordination. Parasols were carried to protect delicate skin from the sun, because a tan marked you as working class, someone who laboured outdoors. Pale skin was fashionable, so ladies would huddle under parasols, creating tiny personal shade zones that did nothing to reduce overall heat, but did successfully prevent vitamin D production. Some women used arsenic-based cosmetics to keep their skin pale, inadvertently poisoning themselves in pursuit of fashion. Others used lemon juice or even lead-based powders. Victorian beauty standards required dedication, toxicity, and a willingness to prioritise appearance over health, comfort, or survival. The clothing couldn't be washed frequently because washing wore out fabric and colours faded, so you'd wear the same sweat-soaked, bacteria-laden garments for days or weeks, airing them out occasionally but never truly cleaning them. The combination of trapped sweat, toxic dyes, and infrequent washing created garments that were essentially wearable petri dishes. The smell was masked with perfumes, which mixed with body odour to create new and interesting olfactory experiences that no one wanted but everyone endured. Fashionable people suffered more than everyone else because they cared more about appearances. Working class people could be slightly more practical. They'd loosen their corsets for hard labour, remove their jackets when no one was watching, wear more breathable fabrics when they could afford them. But middle and upper class Victorians were trapped by social expectations, unable to make practical choices without risking social censure. Better to faint from your corset than be seen without one. Better to sweat through your wool jacket than be thought common for removing it. The truly insane part is that everyone knew this was unhealthy. Doctors published articles about the dangers of tight lacing. Reformers created rational dress movements promoting more comfortable clothing. Common sense screamed that maybe wearing wool in 95-degree heat was a bad idea. But fashion prevailed over health, appearance over comfort, social acceptance over survival. The Victorians chose suffering because the alternative, being unfashionable, was apparently worse than physical distress. Looking good didn't just hurt, it could genuinely kill you. And for many Victorians, that was a price they were willing to pay. Need to buy groceries? Better get to the market early before the sun turns everything into a science experiment. Victorian food markets in summer were extraordinary displays of decay. Meat hung from hooks, unwrapped and unrefrigerated, covered in flies and slowly cooking in the heat. Fish sat in wooden boxes, their eyes clouding over, their smell announcing their presence 3 streets away. The Victorian food market was where optimism went to die, slowly and with a terrible smell. Markets would open at dawn, and by mid-morning in summer, the degradation was already well underway. Meat vendors would set up their stalls displaying cuts of beef, pork, mutton and poultry, all hanging in the open air like some kind of carnivorous art installation. No glass cases, no refrigeration, no protective covering. Just raw meat dangling in the heat, while flies performed their mating rituals on the surface. The flies were so numerous that the meat would appear to shimmer and move, a living blanket of insects crawling across every surface. Vendors would wave cloths or brushes to shoo them away when customers approached, but the flies would just lift off briefly and resettle the moment attention turned elsewhere. Some meat would be so covered in flies that you couldn't see the actual colour of the flesh beneath. This was considered normal. People would just brush off the flies, buy their meat, and hope that cooking it thoroughly would kill whatever the flies had left behind. The smell was a symphony of decomposition. In the early morning it was merely unpleasant. The natural scent of raw meat mixed with the general market atmosphere of vegetables, bodies and commerce. By noon, it had evolved into something more aggressive. The meat would start to turn, developing the sweet, sickly smell of proteins breaking down. By afternoon, the stench could make you gag from 20 feet away. Vendors whose meat was particularly ripe would try to disguise it with heavy doses of spices, or by placing the worst pieces toward the back of their displays, hoping customers wouldn't notice until after they'd committed to a purchase. Quality control didn't exist in any meaningful sense. There were no health inspectors randomly checking meat for safety, no regulations about how long meat could sit out before being sold, no refrigeration requirements or temperature controls. If meat looked obviously rotten, green, actively liquefying, crawling with maggots, vendors might mark it down or trim off the worst bits, but anything short of obvious putrescence was considered sellable. Slightly off was just part of the meat buying experience. Butchers had tricks to make old meat seem fresher. They'd rub it with sheep's blood to restore colour to greying flesh. They'd blow air into it with tubes to make it look plumper and pinker. Some would wash meat in chemicals or dip it in borax to mask the smell of decomposition. Others would simply trim away the most obviously spoiled parts and sell the rest at full price. Caveat emptor taken to horrifying extremes. Let the buyer beware, especially if they value their intestinal health. Fish vendors occupied their own special circle of market hell. Fish spoils even faster than meat, and in summer heat, the degradation happened at breakneck speed. The fish would arrive at market in the morning, having already spent hours or even days since being caught. They'd be dumped into wooden crates and displayed in the sun, their scales drying out, their eyes clouding over, their gills turning from bright red to dull brown. The smell of the fish section could overpower every other market odour, a combination of rotting seafood, fish guts and ocean decay that would cling to your clothes and hair for hours after you left. Fishmongers would sprinkle their catch with water to keep it looking moist and fresh, which helped preserve the appearance but did nothing about the bacteria multiplying in the warm flesh. Some would arrange the fish artfully, propping up their heads to make them look alert and lively, despite being very much dead and increasingly rotten. The truly unscrupulous vendors would mix fresh fish on top of older stock, hoping customers would judge the whole batch by the topmost layer. Shellfish were particularly dangerous in summer. Oysters, mussels and other mollusks would sit out for hours, sometimes days, slowly dying or decomposing in their shells. Bad shellfish could kill you outright, or make you wish you were dead through violent food poisoning. Yet oysters were hugely popular among all social classes, sold from street carts and market stalls to people who had no way of knowing if they were buying fresh seafood or a case of cholera in a shell. The produce section would seem like a safer bet, but Victorian market vegetables came with their own issues. They'd be displayed in open bins and baskets, covered in dirt from the fields, dirt that might be mixed with manure used as fertilizer. Customers would handle the produce with unwashed hands, then put it back if they didn't want it, creating a wonderful bacteria sharing system. In summer, softer fruits and vegetables would start to rot in the heat, developing soft spots, mold and insect infestations right there on the market stalls. Vendors would try to hide damaged produce by arranging the best pieces on top and burying the spoiled ones underneath. You'd buy a basket of apples only to discover when you got home that half of them were rotten at the core. Strawberries would be mouldy underneath their perfect top layer. Potatoes would be soft and sprouting. The market philosophy seemed to be, sell it before it completely disintegrates, and customers played a daily game of trying to spot the deception before parting with their money. Dairy products were sold from market stalls with no cold storage whatsoever. Butter would be sitting in crocks, slowly melting into yellow puddles. Cheese would sweat in the heat, developing interesting new flavours and textures that weren't part of the original aging process. Milk was sold from large containers, ladled out into customers' jugs, with no way to know how long it had been sitting there, or how many times it had been diluted with contaminated water to stretch the supply. The milk situation deserves special attention because it was spectacularly corrupt. Milk sellers would water down their milk to increase profits, sometimes by 50% or more. They'd add chalk or plaster to make the watered milk look whiter and thicker. Some added formaldehyde to keep it from souring as quickly, inadvertently turning milk into an embalming fluid. The milk you bought might be part milk, part water, part chalk, and part poison. In summer, even the most heavily adulterated milk would start to sour within hours, developing that distinctive smell and clumpy texture that meant you should probably not drink it. People drank it anyway. Bread, which you'd think would be relatively safe, was subject to its own forms of adulteration. Bakers would add alum to make bread whiter, which was technically illegal but widely practiced. They'd bulk out flour with chalk, sawdust, or even ground bones to increase their profits. The wholesome bread you bought might contain ingredients that had never seen a wheat field. In summer, bread would also develop mould remarkably quickly, growing colourful fuzzy patches within a day or two, if stored in warm, humid conditions. Street vendors operated throughout markets, selling prepared food that was even more dubious than the raw ingredients. Meat pies of mysterious content, shellfish that might have died that morning or last week, fruits that had been cut open to reveal their spoiled interiors only after purchase. These vendors had no permanent locations, no reputations to protect, and could disappear if their food made enough people sick. They were the ultimate food gamble, cheap, convenient, and potentially lethal. The meat pies sold by street vendors were legendary for their questionable contents. They were supposed to contain beef, pork, or mutton, but cost-cutting vendors would use whatever meat they could get cheaply. Diseased animals rejected by legitimate butchers, cats, dogs, rats. There are documented cases of all of these ending up in street vendor meat pies. The heavy pastry and aggressive seasoning would disguise the taste and texture, and most customers either didn't notice or didn't want to know what they were eating. Market timing was crucial for anyone who cared about food safety. Early morning shoppers got first choice of the freshest food, whatever fresh meant when nothing was refrigerated. By mid-morning, the best items were gone, and what remained had been sitting in the heat for hours. By afternoon, only the desperate or poor would shop, buying deeply discounted items that were approaching or had crossed into the territory of definitely spoiled. Poor families had no choice but to buy the cheapest food available, which meant the oldest, most degraded items. They'd buy meat that was green at the edges, fish that was clearly past its prime, vegetables that were more rot than food. Then they'd take it home and try to salvage what they could, cutting away obviously bad parts and cooking the rest as thoroughly as possible. Food poisoning was so common among the poor that it was almost an expected part of weekly life. The market floors were slick with dropped food, animal blood, fish guts, and unidentifiable liquids. In summer heat, this organic soup would ferment, creating treacherous walking conditions and contributing its own notes to the market's aromatic bouquet. Rats would feast on the dropped scraps scurrying between stalls in broad daylight. Dogs would fight over discarded meat scraps. The entire market was essentially a giant feeding station for every pest species in the city. Hygiene among vendors was non-existent by modern standards. They'd handle money, then handle food, then wipe their hands on their already filthy aprons. They'd sneeze or cough without covering their mouths, spraying whatever they were selling with bacteria. They'd have open sores or obvious infections and still work with food all day. There was no concept of food handler certification or health requirements for vendors. If you were strong enough to stand at a market stall for 12 hours, you were qualified. The market would operate through the hottest parts of the day because commerce couldn't stop just because conditions were dangerous. Vendors who left early would lose income. Customers who waited would have fewer options. So everyone participated in this daily ritual of selling and buying food that was slowly spoiling in the summer sun, hoping that cooking would solve problems that heat, flies, and time had created. Some markets had partially covered stalls, offering minimal protection from direct sunlight. Others were completely open air, offering no protection at all. The food in covered stalls didn't last significantly longer because the air was still hot and the flies still found their way in. The only real advantage was psychological. At least you weren't watching the sun literally cook your dinner before you bought it. By the end of market day, unsold food would be either saved for the next day, meaning it would start the next market day already compromised, or sold at rock-bottom prices to the poorest customers. Some vendors would simply throw unsold food into the street, where it would be scavenged by animals, desperately poor people, or left to rot and add to the general street filth. The waste was enormous, but keeping food overnight without refrigeration often meant it would be completely unsaleable by morning anyway. Shopping at Victorian summer markets required a combination of optimism, strong stomach, and willingness to gamble with food poisoning. You'd inspect items carefully, smelling and squeezing to check for spoilage, knowing that your assessment might be wrong. You'd negotiate with vendors who had every incentive to mislead you about their product's quality. You'd carry your purchases home quickly, hoping they'd survive the journey without degrading further in the heat, and then you'd cook everything thoroughly, say a prayer, and hope that the combination of heat and divine intervention would be enough to kill whatever bacteria, parasites, or general nastiness your food contained. Welcome to Victorian grocery shopping, where every meal started with a visit to an open-air science experiment and hope was the main ingredient. Victorians didn't just work through the summer, they also tried to have fun, with varying degrees of success. Public parks became crowded with people desperate for any breeze, any shade, any relief from their airless homes. The problem was that everyone else had the same idea, so parks became packed, sweaty, and about as relaxing as a sardine can. London's parks, Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Victoria Park, were designed as green lungs for the city, places where people could escape urban squalor and breathe cleaner air. In summer, they became refugee camps for the overheated masses. Families would arrive early, claiming spots under trees like it was a competitive sport. By mid-morning, every patch of shade would be occupied by multiple families sitting uncomfortably close to strangers, all pretending this was pleasant and relaxing. The grass, what little survived the constant foot traffic, would be brown and dead by midsummer. The ponds, meant to be picturesque water features, would become stagnant and fetid, developing thick green algae blooms and attracting mosquitoes by the millions. Swimming was technically prohibited, but desperate people, especially children, would wade in anyway, cooling themselves in water that was part pond, part sewage runoff, entirely disgusting. Parents would let them because the alternative was watching them suffer in the heat, and what was a little contaminated water compared to heat stroke? The wealthy would promenade through the parks in their finest clothes, which in summer meant their finest hot, heavy, uncomfortable clothes. Promenading was a social activity where you'd walk slowly around the park to see and be seen, displaying your fashion sense and social status. In 90-degree heat while wearing wool and corsets, this was less pleasant stroll and more fashionable death march. Women would faint regularly, men would sweat through their jackets, and everyone would pretend they were having a marvellous time because admitting discomfort wasn't proper. Street entertainment provided another option for those seeking diversion. Organ grinders would set up on corners, cranking out tinny music while trained monkeys performed tricks. In summer heat, both the musicians and their monkey assistants looked equally miserable. The monkeys, dressed in tiny costumes, would perform their routines while clearly overheating, occasionally biting their handlers out of what can only be assumed was justifiable, heat-induced rage. Punch and Judy shows were wildly popular with children and adults alike. These puppet shows featured extreme violence, domestic abuse presented as comedy, and plots that made no sense. They were performed in small portable theatres by operators who stood inside the booth, essentially working inside a small wooden oven while doing voices and manipulating puppets. By the end of a summer performance, the puppeteer would emerge drenched in sweat, possibly hallucinating from heat exposure, but at least they'd entertained the crowd. Music halls offered indoor entertainment, which sounds promising until you remember that indoor venues in summer were basically architectural sweatboxes. The music hall would be packed with people, all of them producing body heat and carbon dioxide, sitting shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches for hours. The air would be thick with tobacco smoke, alcohol fumes, and the combined scent of hundreds of unwashed bodies. Performers on stage would be lit by gas lamps or early electric lights that generated even more heat, creating a microclimate on stage that regularly caused singers to faint mid-performance. The entertainment itself was a mixed bag of comedy acts, musical performances, acrobatics, and occasionally something educational or uplifting, though mostly it was lowbrow humour and innuendo that would make modern audiences uncomfortable. But in summer, even watching a bad performance in unbearable heat was preferable to sitting at home in your stifling room. At least in the music hall, there was beer, companionship, and the chance to forget how miserable you were for a few hours. Pleasure gardens offered a more upscale entertainment option. Places like Vauxhall Gardens and Kremen Gardens featured illuminated walkways, orchestras, fireworks, acrobats, and various spectacles designed to dazzle and delight. In summer, they'd be packed with families, couples, and groups of friends seeking evening entertainment. The problem was that pleasure gardens were still outdoors, which meant the heat persisted even into the evening. The lanterns and gas lights that illuminated the gardens generated additional heat, turning romantic evening strolls into sweaty trudges through crowds. The Thames, despite being an open sewer, was still used for recreational boating. Rowing was a popular pastime for those who could afford it, or who belonged to rowing clubs. People would row up and down the river, trying to ignore the smell and the occasional floating debris that might be garbage or might be something worse. River races and regattas drew huge crowds who would stand on the banks in the sun for hours, watching boats go back and forth while slowly dehydrating and developing sunburns that Victorian medicine would treat with, you guessed it, bloodletting. Seaside trips became increasingly popular as railway expansion made coastal towns accessible to middle-class families. Places like Brighton, Margate and Blackpool were marketed as healthy escapes from London's summer misery. The reality was more complicated. The trains taking people to the seaside were packed, hot, and uncomfortable. The seaside towns themselves became overcrowded with visitors. The beaches were jammed with people, many of whom couldn't actually swim because swimming was considered dangerous and immodest. Victorian beach fashion was spectacularly impractical. Women who wanted to swim would use bathing machines, wheeled cabins pulled into the water by horses so women could change and enter the water without being seen in their bathing costumes. The bathing costumes themselves were heavy wool garments that covered women from neck to ankle, weighing them down in the water and providing roughly the same functionality as trying to swim while wearing a carpet. Many women drowned in these outfits, their heavy, water-soaked costumes pulling them under. Men's bathing costumes were slightly less absurd, but still covered them from shoulders to knees. The concept of swimming trunks, or heaven forbid, swimming nude like people had done for millennia, was considered absolutely scandalous. So men swam in what amounted to wet wool onesies that chafed, constrained movement, and took hours to dry. The joy of swimming was tempered considerably by the discomfort of the swimwear. Even on the beach, social rules remained rigid. You couldn't remove too much clothing, couldn't behave too freely, couldn't relax too much without risking social censure. Wealthy visitors would rent beach chairs and sit fully dressed under umbrellas, attempting to enjoy the sea air while remaining as covered as they would be in London. The working-class visitors would paddle in the shallows or build sandcastles with their children, but always maintaining a level of propriety that must have been exhausting in the heat. Piers were built extending into the sea, featuring pavilions with entertainment, food vendors and amusements. These became packed with visitors walking back and forth, eating dubious seafood and occasionally falling into the water when the crowds pressed too tightly. The piers offered no shade, and the wooden planks would absorb the sun's heat until walking barefoot on them would burn your feet. But they were novel and exciting, representing modern leisure and seaside sophistication, so people flocked to them despite the discomfort. For those who couldn't afford seaside trips, rivers near London provided swimming opportunities. Spots along the Thames where the water was slightly less contaminated, which is a very low bar, would become crowded with swimmers. Boys would strip down and jump in, creating scandals and delighting themselves in equal measure. Adults would paddle along the banks or wade in the shallows, cooling themselves in water that was probably slowly poisoning them, but at least felt good in the moment. Fairs and exhibitions offered another entertainment option. The Great Exhibition of 1851 had popularised massive public exhibitions showcasing industry, culture and innovation. Subsequent exhibitions and travelling fairs would set up in various locations, featuring everything from the latest inventions to human oddity shows that we now recognise as deeply exploitative and problematic. In summer, these exhibitions were held in massive buildings or tents that had no air conditioning and minimal ventilation. Visitors would pay their admission and shuffle through in massive crowds, trying to see the exhibits while being pressed on all sides by sweating strangers. The exhibits themselves often generated additional heat, industrial machinery demonstrations, gas-lit displays, scientific apparatus that ran on steam or electricity. By the end of a visit, you'd be exhausted, overheated, and wondering if that was actually fun or just something you survived. Sporting events drew enthusiastic crowds despite the heat. Cricket matches, horse races, boxing matches, all of these would proceed regardless of temperature. Spectators would stand or sit in the sun for hours, watching competitions that could last all day. Cricket was particularly masochistic in this regard, with matches sometimes lasting multiple days. Fans would return day after day, slowly cooking in their formal attire while watching men in white wool uniforms run around in the blazing sun. The players had it worse, wearing heavy cricket whites and playing through the hottest parts of the day because stopping for something trivial like potential heat death wasn't sporting. Street performances of all kinds would pop up throughout cities. Jugglers, acrobats, fire eaters. Yes, fire eaters in summer, because apparently regular summer heat wasn't enough. Sword swallowers, escape artists, and strong men would perform for whatever coin spectators would throw. These performers worked in full sun, in their costumes, performing physically demanding acts while steadily dehydrating and overheating. It was entertainment through suffering, and audiences loved it. Drinking establishments offered another escape, though escape might be generous. Pubs and gin palaces would be packed with people seeking liquid refreshment and air that was only slightly less stifling than home. The combination of body heat, alcohol fumes, tobacco smoke and poor ventilation created an atmosphere you could almost chew. But at least there was beer, company and temporary numbness to your circumstances. Many Victorians spent their summer evenings in pubs, slowly pickled in their own sweat and whatever alcohol they could afford. For children, entertainment was mostly improvised from whatever materials were available. They'd play in the streets, dodging traffic, avoiding horse manure, creating games from sticks and stones and imagination. In summer, they'd seek out any water source for playing: fountains, pumps, puddles, rain gutters. They'd chase each other through the heat until they collapse from exhaustion, then do it again. children's capacity for finding entertainment in miserable conditions is simultaneously admirable and depressing. Evening entertainment for the middle and upper classes might include soirees, dinner parties, or musical evenings where people would gather in someone's home to socialise, eat, and listen to amateur performances. These events required hosts to prepare elaborate meals in overheated kitchens, guests to dress formally despite the temperature, and everyone to pretend that sitting in a stuffy parlour, listening to someone's daughter murder a piano piece was the height of civilization. The performances would often be dreadful, the food would be questionable after sitting in the heat, and everyone would be uncomfortable. But social obligations demanded attendance. Theatre performances continued through the summer in venues that were notoriously hot and uncomfortable. Actors would perform in heavy costumes and makeup under hot stage lights, sometimes fainting from heat exposure mid-scene. Audiences would sit packed together in the stalls and galleries, fanning themselves uselessly while trying to follow plots that became increasingly hard to concentrate on as the temperature rose. Intermission was less about refreshment and more about escaping to the lobbies to gasp for slightly less hot air. The desperately poor had virtually no entertainment options that cost money. Their fun was found in free activities, sitting outside to escape their rooms, gossiping with neighbours, watching street life pass by, occasionally scraping together pennies for the most basic amusements. Children would play in the streets because there was nowhere else. Adults would sit on doorsteps in the evening, too tired from work to do much else but chat and hope for a breeze. Victorian summer entertainment wasn't really about fun in the way we understand it. It was about survival, finding ways to endure the heat, to distract yourself from discomfort, to maintain some semblance of normal life despite conditions that made normal life nearly impossible. The fact that Victorians pursued entertainment at all in these conditions speaks to human resilience and our deep need for diversion, even when diversion means slowly cooking while pretending to enjoy yourself. Because nothing says having a good time quite like fainting at the park while wearing 17 layers of wool and telling everyone what a lovely day it is. If you were poor, sick, or elderly, Victorian summer had a special kind of misery reserved for you: the workhouse. These institutions, designed to house the destitute, were overcrowded, underfunded nightmares even in winter. In summer, they became death traps. Hundreds of people crammed into buildings with no ventilation, sharing beds, sharing diseases, sharing the slow realization that this might be where their story ended. The Victorian workhouse system was based on a simple, cruel principle. Poverty was a moral failing that needed to be punished. If you couldn't support yourself, you could enter the workhouse. But conditions would be deliberately made so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would choose to stay. The theory was that this would discourage laziness and encourage people to find work. The reality was that it created institutions of systematic suffering where the most vulnerable members of society were warehoused in conditions that would make a prison look appealing. Workhouses were designed to hold perhaps a few hundred people. In practice, they regularly held twice or 3 times their intended capacity. Every room would be crammed with beds, or more accurately, hard wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses, placed so close together that you couldn't walk between them. You'd share your bed with at least one other person, possibly several, depending on how overcrowded things were. In summer, sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed in a room with dozens of other beds and no air circulation was like being sealed in a human oven set to slow roast. The buildings themselves were architectural embodiments of Victorian penny pinching. Large, blocky structures with small windows that opened poorly or not at all. High ceilings that were meant to provide airiness, but instead just trapped hot air above everyone's heads. Thick walls that held heat from the day and radiated it through the night. No thought given to cross-ventilation or cooling strategies. The workhouse was designed to be cheap to build and operate, and comfort for the inmates wasn't even a consideration. Men and women were separated in workhouses, which meant families were torn apart on arrival. Married couples who'd been together for decades would be forcibly separated, children taken from parents, siblings split up by gender. In summer, this separation meant that families couldn't even comfort each other during the worst of the heat and disease. A mother would worry about her children in another wing, unable to see them, unable to know if they were healthy or suffering or dying. This psychological torture was considered part of the deterrent effect. The daily routine in a workhouse was designed to be punishing. Inmates would be woken at dawn and immediately set to work. The work varied. Picking oakum, unravelling old rope which destroyed your fingers, breaking stones, crushing bones for fertiliser, anything tedious and physically demanding. In summer, this work would be done in unventilated workshops that were already sweltering by mid-morning. The oakum shed, where residents would sit for hours pulling apart tarred rope fibres, would fill with dust and tar fumes that made breathing difficult even when it was cool. In summer, it was suffocating. Stone breaking was done outdoors, which sounds better until you realise it meant sitting in full sun with a heavy hammer, smashing rocks into smaller rocks for hours. No shade, no breaks except for a brief lunch period, no water provided except at mealtimes. Men and women too old or weak for hard labour would still be forced to work, their bodies giving out under the strain and heat. Collapsing from exhaustion was met with punishment for laziness, not sympathy or medical care. The food in workhouses was famously terrible, designed to meet the absolute minimum nutritional requirements while being as unappetising as possible. Breakfast might be gruel, watery oatmeal with no salt, sugar or milk. Lunch could be bread and cheese if you were lucky, or more gruel if you weren't. Dinner was usually a thin soup or stew made from the cheapest ingredients available, sometimes meat but often just vegetables that were starting to turn. In summer, this food would spoil even faster than usual, developing interesting odours and textures that made the already unpalatable meals actively dangerous. The dining halls where these meals were consumed were large rooms with long tables, where inmates would sit in silence. Talking during meals was prohibited. In summer, these halls would be stifling, hundreds of bodies packed together, generating heat and breathing stale air while trying to choke down hot soup in temperatures that made eating almost impossible. Many inmates would be too heat-sick to eat, which weakened them further, creating a vicious cycle of malnutrition and heat exhaustion. Water was rationed in workhouses not because there wasn't enough, but because authorities believed giving inmates free access to water would encourage laziness. They might spend too much time drinking instead of working. Water was provided at mealtimes and sometimes in the evening, but not throughout the day. In summer, when dehydration was a constant threat, this policy was essentially a slow form of torture. Inmates would work in the heat for hours with no water, becoming increasingly weak and confused from dehydration. The washing facilities were grossly inadequate. A workhouse might have a few basins or a single pump for hundreds of residents. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible. You'd get a chance to wash maybe once a week, using cold water and harsh soap, sharing the same basins and water with dozens of others. In summer, when everyone was sweating constantly, the accumulated filth became overwhelming. Inmates would develop rashes, infections and infestations because they simply had no way to keep themselves clean. The sick wards in workhouses were particularly horrifying. These rooms housed inmates with everything from minor ailments to cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and various unnamed fevers. There was minimal medical care. Maybe a doctor would visit once a week if the workhouse was lucky. Nurses were often other inmates who had no training beyond basic first aid. In summer, sick wards became death chambers, where diseases spread rapidly through the cramped, hot, unventilated spaces. Patients with infectious diseases weren't isolated. Someone with cholera might be in a bed next to someone with a broken leg next to someone who was just elderly and weak. The contamination was immediate and thorough. Cholera patients would have uncontrollable diarrhea, creating sanitation nightmares in rooms where dozens of sick people shared chamber pots or had to be cleaned by other inmates. The smell alone in these wards during summer would make modern hospital staff refuse to enter. Children in workhouses suffered particularly acutely. Separated from their parents, they'd be housed in children's wings where they'd receive minimal education and maximum labour. Even small children would be put to work, their small hands useful for picking oakum or other detail-oriented tasks. In summer heat, children would work alongside adults, with no concession made for their age or physical limitations. Many didn't survive their first workhouse summer. Elderly inmates faced their own special horrors. Too old for hard physical labour but still required to work, they'd be given tasks that were less strenuous but no less tedious: sorting rags, sewing, making rope. Many were in the workhouse because they'd outlived their families or could no longer support themselves. They'd spend their final years in overheated rooms surrounded by strangers performing meaningless tasks while waiting to die. Summer accelerated this process significantly, with mortality rates among elderly inmates spiking dramatically during hot months. The dormitories at night were scenes from nightmares, dozens or hundreds of people crammed into long rooms lined with beds, windows closed or barely opened. The air thick and hot and filled with the sounds of coughing, moaning, snoring and crying. You'd lie on your thin mattress, pressed against strangers, breathing air that had been through everyone else's lungs first, slowly baking through the night. Sleep was nearly impossible, but staying awake in that heat was torture. Bedbugs, lice and fleas infested every workhouse dormitory. The close quarters and irregular washing of bedding created perfect conditions for parasites. In summer, these infestations would explode, with insects breeding rapidly in the heat. You'd be covered in bites, itching constantly, unable to escape the parasites because they were literally everywhere, in the mattresses, the beds, the walls, your clothes. Some inmates would scratch themselves raw, creating wounds that would become infected in the heat and lack of hygiene. The toilets in workhouses were communal privies that served hundreds of people. These would be basic structures, often just holes over pits, located in outbuildings away from the main dormitories. In summer, the heat would intensify the smell to unbearable levels. The pits would overflow, creating sewage lakes around the facilities. Inmates would have to walk through these contaminated areas multiple times daily. The spread of disease through fecal-oral transmission was essentially guaranteed. Punishments in workhouses were harsh, and often involved solitary confinement in small cells with no ventilation. In summer, being locked in a tiny, airless cell for days was potentially lethal. Inmates would emerge from punishment cells delirious from heat exposure, dehydrated, sometimes permanently damaged. The punishment cells were also used for inmates who were considered mentally ill. There was no distinction between psychiatric treatment and punishment. People with mental health conditions would be locked in hot cells and forgotten. Death rates in workhouses always increased in summer, but authorities rarely acknowledged this as a systemic problem. They'd blame individual constitutions, moral weaknesses, or act of God, rather than admitting that their institutions were killing people through neglect and deliberate cruelty. Bodies would be removed regularly, buried in paupers' graves with no ceremony or marking. Families often wouldn't even be notified that their loved ones had died. The staff in workhouses were generally as miserable as the inmates, though at least they could leave at the end of their shifts. They were overworked, underpaid, and responsible for controlling hundreds of desperate people in terrible conditions. Some were cruel by nature, taking out their frustrations on the inmates. Others tried to be kind but were overwhelmed by the sheer scope of suffering they were expected to manage. Most just became numb to it, treating inmates as problems to be processed rather than humans in distress. Escaping the workhouse was difficult. You were technically free to leave, but if you did, you had nowhere to go and no resources. Many inmates were too sick or old to survive outside. Children couldn't leave until they reached working age, and there was a social stigma attached to workhouse residents. If you'd been in the workhouse, employers were reluctant to hire you. Landlords wouldn't rent to you, and your community might shun you. It was a trap that was easy to enter and nearly impossible to escape. Some inmates did everything they could to avoid going to workhouses, even if it meant living on the streets or starving. The workhouse was seen as the absolute last resort, the place you went when every other option had been exhausted. The fact that people preferred to risk death on the streets rather than enter the workhouse tells you everything about how terrible these institutions were. And in summer, when the workhouse became a disease-ridden oven of human suffering, that choice made even more sense. Social reformers documented workhouse conditions extensively, writing exposés and conducting investigations that shocked middle-class readers. Charles Dickens wrote about workhouses with barely contained rage. Journalists would go undercover and publish their findings. The public would be horrified, demand change, and then largely forget about it because the inmates were poor and therefore easy to ignore. Reforms came slowly, grudgingly, and often cosmetically without addressing the fundamental cruelty of the system. The Victorian workhouse in summer was where society's safety net became a death trap. It was where people who'd fallen on hard times through no fault of their own would be punished for their poverty by being slow-cooked in overcrowded buildings while being worked to exhaustion and denied basic human dignity. It was systematic cruelty disguised as charity, and it was one of the darkest aspects of Victorian society. And thousands of people lived through it every summer, or didn't live through it, dying in overheated dormitories surrounded by strangers, while the authorities carefully noted their deaths in ledgers and moved on to the next batch of desperate souls who had nowhere else to go. So you've survived a single summer in Victorian England? Congratulations. You've woken up in stifling heat to wash your face in yesterday's grey water. You've eaten breakfast that was already rotting. You've dressed yourself in 17 layers of suffocating fabric because society demanded it. You've walked through streets that were essentially open sewers, breathing air thick with the smell of horse manure and human waste. You've drunk water that was probably contaminated with cholera. You've worked 12 hours in conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation ever written. You've watched children labour alongside you because childhood wasn't a protected time. It was just smaller hands for dangerous work. You've navigated markets where the food was covered in flies and slowly decomposing in the heat. You've tried to have fun in parks so crowded they felt like refugee camps. You've watched neighbours die from diseases that could have been prevented with clean water and basic sanitation. You've seen the poorest among you trapped in workhouses that were essentially death traps with bureaucracy. And through it all, you've maintained the appearance of respectability, because admitting you were suffering wasn't proper. The Victorian summer wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a gauntlet of survival that tested every person who lived through it. The poor died in shocking numbers, packed into slums with no ventilation, no clean water, and no hope of escape. The middle class suffered in their corseted, wool-covered misery, fainting from heat exhaustion while pretending everything was fine. Even the wealthy, with all their resources and privilege, couldn't buy their way out of the stench, the heat, or the diseases that didn't care about social class. And yet, somehow, people endured. They found ways to survive the unsurvivable. They developed coping strategies, banking fires at night, sleeping in shifts, sharing body heat in winter and space in summer. They built communities that looked after the vulnerable, even when they barely had enough for themselves. They laughed, loved, told stories, and found moments of joy in between the suffering. Because humans are stubborn like that. Even when the world is actively trying to kill you, you find reasons to keep going. The Victorians weren't superhuman. They weren't tougher or more resilient than we are. They were just people, like us, trying to survive in conditions that were absolutely brutal. Many didn't make it. The mortality statistics from Victorian summers are genuinely horrifying. But the ones who did survive carried forward, one sweltering day at a time, until eventually, slowly, things began to change. The Great Stink finally forced authorities to build proper sewers. Germ theory gradually replaced miasma theory, leading to actual medical treatments instead of bloodletting. Labour laws started protecting children and workers from the worst exploitation. Building codes improved ventilation and sanitation. Clean water became more accessible. Refrigeration was invented. Understanding of disease prevention grew. None of these changes happened quickly or easily. They required decades of suffering, advocacy, and reform, but they happened. So tonight, as you lie in your temperature-controlled bedroom, clean sheets pulled up to your chin, maybe take a moment to appreciate what you have. Turn on your tap and marvel at the clean, cold water that flows without thought. Flush your toilet and consider the miracle of modern plumbing. Open your refrigerator and thank the fact that your food won't kill you. Strip down to comfortable pajamas and breathe freely, without corsets or heavy wool compressing your organs. Think about the Victorian who would have given anything for just one of these comforts. The mother who lost children to cholera that clean water would have prevented. The factory worker who collapsed from heat stroke because taking breaks wasn't allowed. The elderly person who died in a workhouse surrounded by strangers, slowly cooking in the summer heat. The child who worked 14-hour days in conditions that would horrify us today. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It taught us, slowly, painfully, that cities need infrastructure, that public health matters, that workers deserve protection, that children should be children, not labourers. Every modern comfort we enjoy was built on the broken backs and shortened lives of people who had no choice but to endure what we would consider unendurable. So sleep well tonight, in your cool, clean, safe space, And maybe whisper a quiet thank you to all those nameless Victorians who suffered through summer after summer, who died so that we might learn, who persevered so that we might inherit a world where summer is uncomfortable but not deadly, where heat is annoying but not lethal, where getting through the day doesn't require heroic levels of endurance. They survived the unsurvivable. They endured the unendurable. They lived through summers that were absolutely horrifying. And somehow, against all odds, they kept going. Just like you will after a good night's sleep in your wonderfully modern bed. Good night.